Step into a Victorian parlour and you're stepping into a shrine, not to a religion, not to a monarch, but to public respectability, the ultimate Victorian deity. This room, and only this room, was allowed to sparkle with enough polished furniture and lace to make visitors believe the entire household lived in a permanent state of spiritual cleanliness and emotional stability. Spoiler, they did not. But Victorian society didn't care about your actual life. They cared about your curtains and what those curtains said about your moral worth. The parlour was the first thing, often the only thing, guests ever saw, which meant it wasn't a room for living. It was a room for performing. If modern living rooms could talk, they'd probably complain about clutter, crumbs, and people putting their feet up on the coffee table. If a Victorian parlour could talk, it would scream constantly out of stress. Families poured astonishing amounts of time, money, and emotional fortitude into making this space look flawless. The chairs had to be perfectly arranged in a way that suggested casual elegance, while also ensuring no one ever actually sat in them. Sofa cushions were stuffed to resemble moral firmness, not human comfort, and the rugs, hand-beaten every single week until they were less floor-covering and more semi-domesticated creature-shedding dust clouds. To Victorians, cleanliness wasn't just cleanliness, it was a coded message. Look at us, we have order, we have discipline, we have a parlour that hasn't been touched by mortal hands since the Crimean War. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Industrialisation and rapid urban growth meant the new middle class was desperate to look respectable, and respectability was measured in how well your furniture reflected light. A polished side table didn't just shine, it whispered, "We're doing fine, better than fine, please notice how fine." A dusty corner, however, shouted, "Moral failure lives here." This pressure turned everyday tasks into Olympic sports. Dusting wasn't just a chore, it was a battle against the universe. Coal soot blew in through every window. Street grime drifted in on every breeze. Even the family's own clothing produced enough fabric lint to make its own depressive weather system. And yet the parlour had to look as untouched as a museum exhibit. Every single day, and Victorians loved their objects. They bought trinkets with the same enthusiasm modern people buy phone chargers, constantly, impulsively, and without remembering how many they already owned. Shells, porcelain dogs, taxidermy birds, decorative boxes, more porcelain dogs. Each object required its own dusting schedule. A Victorian parlour shelf was basically a small army of knickknacks, organised in a formation so complex that the average visitor could get lost between the figurines. To keep the illusion intact, families often restricted access to the parlour entirely. Children were banned, pets were banned, husbands were cautiously tolerated. The room was treated like a historical artefact, looked at, admired, but never ever used. The family might be eating simple meals, arguing about money, or stepping over laundry in the kitchen, but if someone knocked on the door unexpectedly, they had approximately 4 seconds to transform themselves from living chaos into picture of Victorian refinement. This is why the sound of the doorbell struck fear into the Victorian soul. Somewhere in Britain, at any given moment, a mother was hissing at her children to wipe your face, straighten your collar, and look like you've never cried in your life, as she sprinted past them to fluff a cushion and realign the doilies. Even the air in the parlour was managed. Heavy drapes kept the sun out because sunlight revealed too much truth. Dust particles, faded upholstery, and the faint outline of the family's actual lifestyle. Air freshening wasn't an option yet, so Victorians relied on tightly sealed windows, scented oils, and the hope that guests wouldn't notice the lingering aroma of coal, cabbage, and yesterday's stress. Of course, all this perfection came at a cost. The pressure to maintain the parlour pushed families into competitive housekeeping, a silent domestic arms race of who could achieve the most decorative suffocation. Women's magazines lectured endlessly about what a good housekeeper looked like, behaved like, and cleaned like. One wrong move and rumours would spread faster than a Victorian cold. Did you see her mantelpiece? Dust, visible dust, on a Tuesday. Victorian homes weren't just hiding flaws, they were hiding the reality that no one lived as perfectly as they pretended. Behind the immaculate parlour door was a world of burnt dinners, hidden laundry, inconvenient relatives, financial worries, medical problems, and the occasional pet catastrophe. But the parlour concealed all that with a polite smile, a polished lamp, and an army of decorative vases. The parlour was proof that the Victorian home operated under one universal law. If a guest can't see the problem does not exist. If the Victorian middle class had a secret weapon, it wasn't money, manners, or even those aggressively polished teapots. It was servants, the silent engines powering every immaculate hallway, every simmering pot, every mysteriously wrinkle-free tablecloth. Victorian households ran on human labour the way modern homes run on electricity. And just like electricity, nobody wanted to see the wires. To outsiders, a Victorian household appeared to operate with graceful ease. The beds were magically made, meals materialised like clockwork, children were washed and clothed before they could protest, and the fires burned cheerfully, without anyone ever acknowledging the person who woke up at dawn to make them burn. But behind the scenes, servants were living a schedule that makes grueling sound like a vacation package. A Victorian servant's day began at a time of morning so early it felt like a personal insult. Think 4:30 a.m, or earlier, or if the family preferred their tea ready before sunrise, which many did. In Victorian Britain, waking up early was seen as a sign of moral discipline, but only for the wealthy. For servants, it wasn't moral virtue, it was survival. They had fires to build, shoes to polish, water to heat, and floors to scrub long before the family even began thinking about opening their eyes to greet the new day. The hierarchy of servants in a mid to upper middle class home was a delicate pyramid. At the top stood the housekeeper and the butler, ruling their respective domestic kingdoms with a blend of sternness, exhaustion, and an uncanny ability to detect smudges from 3 rooms away. Below them stood the maids, parlour maids, housemaids, kitchen maids, and the ever-suffering scullery maid, whose official job description might as well have been human sacrifice to grease. Each role came with a specific set of duties that had to be executed with precision, because precision meant respectability. If the silverware had a wayward fingerprint, social disaster. If the carpet wasn't brushed in the correct pattern, shame upon the family name. If the fire didn't burn brightly at breakfast, the apocalypse might as well have begun. And through all this, servants were expected to remain invisible. They moved like shadows, quiet, fast, and with the uncanny gift of appearing exactly where needed, and vanishing before anyone remembered they existed. A well-trained Victorian servant could carry an entire tray of dishes, dodge a child, avoid a dog, and slip behind a doorframe all in one smooth movement. Teleportation wasn't a skill, it was a requirement. This invisibility wasn't just practical, it was a cultural expectation. A servant who spoke too loudly, walked too heavily, or made their presence known at the wrong moment risked being scolded, dismissed, or subjected to a lecture about propriety that lasted longer than a church sermon. The Victorian ideal was a household where tasks accomplished themselves, as if the home were enchanted by polite housekeeping fairies instead of overworked humans with aching feet. Meals were one of the most demanding performances. Breakfast, dinner, tea, supper, each required hours of preparation, timing, coordination, and enough lifting to build Olympic-level muscle. The kitchen was its own battlefield. Boiling pots, endless chopping, mountains of dishes, and ovens with attitudes. The cook was the general, the kitchen maids the soldiers, and the scullery maid the brave little foot soldier who washed every pot and pan that ever touched flame or flour. If pots could talk, they'd apologise to her. Laundry days were even worse. Laundry wasn't just washing, it was whiling, scrubbing, wringing, drying, pressing, folding, and praying for strength. It was a full-body workout that lasted from dawn until collapse, and heaven help the maid who let a shirt shrink or a dress fade. Victorian clothing was practically designed to make laundry as emotionally painful as possible. Despite the brutal workload, Victorian servants lived under strict behavioural codes. They could not sit in the family's presence. They could not question orders. They could not laugh too loudly or look too tired, or exhibit emotions stronger than mild efficiency. They lived in cramped attic rooms, pantry cupboards, basement quarters, anywhere they could fit a bed and not bother the family. Their personal lives were governed by bells, schedules and expectations. If Downton Abbey had told the truth, it would have been a horror show. Yet the paradox is this: households decided on servants so completely that the entire social structure would have collapsed without them. Victorian society loved to pretend the home ran on proper morals and domestic virtue. In reality, it ran on people who spent 14-hour days keeping the illusion intact. The family might take credit for the tidy dining room, but servants knew who actually scrubbed the gravy off the table leg. Victorian households looked calm, refined and orderly because the people who kept them that way weren't allowed to look anything else. Servants were the backbone of the home, the quiet force that made everything appear effortless. Their work wasn't meant to be seen, but the results had to shine brighter than the silver they polished. Behind every immaculate rug, every folded napkin, every steaming dish of food was a servant who had been awake long before the sun, working in silence to maintain the family's perfect image. Victorian households didn't just hide their secret, they hid the people who made perfection possible. If you ever thought your last-minute stuff everything behind the couch before company arrives strategy was impressive, Victorian households would like you to hold their lace-trimmed tea set. Because no one, absolutely no one, panic-hid household chaos quite like the Victorians. When a guest knocked unexpectedly, the family didn't just tidy, they mobilised. The home became a battlefield, and clutter was the enemy to be driven into captivity. You must understand, Victorians lived during an era of intense social surveillance. Your home wasn't just where you slept and ate. It was a moral report card that visitors inspected with the focus of a detective and the judgment of a mother-in-law. A dusty corner? Sign of moral decay. A misplaced boot? Evidence of negligent upbringing. A stray stocking. Social catastrophe of Shakespearean proportions. This pressure created an unofficial Victorian emergency protocol known as hide everything anywhere immediately. Families perfected the technique the same way soldiers perfect drills, through practice, panic, and the knowledge that failure meant ruinous gossip spreading across town by sundown. The moment someone shouted, "Visitors!" the household launched into a highly choreographed chaos. Children were shoved into nicer clothes. Pets were bribed into silence. And all visible objects that weren't symmetrical or spotless were banished to shadowy corners of the home. The first and most sacred hiding spot was the wardrobe. Not the elegant carved mahogany one in the parlour, that was for show, but the wardrobes in bedrooms and hallways. These wooden giants became temporary prisons for umbrellas, baskets, hats, toys, newspapers, mending projects, laundry piles, and anything else that dared to exist in the open. Wardrobes groaned under the burden of Victorian panic stuffing, their doors barely able to close. Introducing new clutter to a full wardrobe was like convincing a cat to take a bath. Possible, but only through brute force and disappointed sighing. The underbed zone was the next frontier of concealment. Victorians didn't have modern storage bins, but they had trunks, hat boxes, fabric bags, and a deep belief that anything shoved under a bed was automatically invisible. Guests rarely entered bedrooms, but the family still treated the underside of the bed like a sacred hiding universe. The average Victorian bed didn't just hold a mattress. It held enough hidden belongings to supply a small expedition. Then there was the guest room, which was rarely used for actual guests. Instead, this room served as a dumping ground for spare furniture, seasonal clothing, random purchases, unfinished sewing, dusty decorations, and whatever clutter didn't fit elsewhere. Guest rooms became clutter graveyards, the Bermuda Triangle of Victorian homes. If an object disappeared, the first place to check wasn't the kitchen or the parlour, it was the guest room, where it sat buried beneath 3 tablecloths, 2 family heirlooms, and a pile of things that might be useful someday but definitely aren't useful now. But perhaps the most impressive demonstration of Victorian emergency concealment came from trunks. Trunks were the Swiss Army knife of hiding places. They stored clothes, linens, tools, toys, letters, and anything else the family didn't want visibly associated with them. Entire family secrets could be contained in one trunk, layered between old blankets and forgotten holiday decorations. Some trunks became so overstuffed that opening them was a risk, similar to opening a shaken bottle of champagne, exhilarating but likely to explode. Victorian clutter wasn't like modern clutter. They didn't have plastic, mass-produced items, cheap decor, or convenience gadgets. What they did have were dozens of household objects they considered essential: antimacassars, those lacy doilies to protect chairs, fancy cloths for special occasions, footstools, sewing baskets, sheet music, multiple lap blankets, gardening hats, specialised cutlery, and small decorative items that multiplied like rabbits whenever a relative visited. And every one of these items needed a place to hide in the event of unexpected visitors. The reason Victorians hid clutter so aggressively wasn't just pride, it was fear. The era was obsessed with orderliness, virtue, and the idea that a proper household reflected a proper soul. If a visitor saw your hallway scattered with boots, they might assume your moral integrity was equally scattered. A messy home meant messy habits meant poverty. And poverty, in Victorian logics, meant questionable character. They didn't just hide their things, they hid the possibility of looking human. The hilarious part? Guests already knew families were hiding things, everyone did it. The polite fiction was simply that no one acknowledged it. If a wardrobe door bulged suspiciously or a bed skirt swelled like it was smuggling illegal furniture, visitors pretended it was completely normal. Victorians were experts in ignoring obvious problems while maintaining facial expressions so polite they bordered on parody. But this hiding frenzy was also part of a cultural shift. With industrialisation bringing more possessions into middle-class homes than ever before, clutter became a new problem, and Victorians didn't have minimalist Pinterest boards to guide them. Their solution? Shove everything out of sight and pray. By the time guests rang the bell, the house looked impeccable. Floors cleared, surfaces gleaming, chaos erased. Visitors entered, impressed by the order, unaware that the hallway wardrobe was currently holding 40% of the household's belongings and could explode at any moment. Victorian families weren't just masters of tidying, they were magicians. They didn't declutter, they made clutter vanish. And if you dared to open a door, a trunk, or a bed skirt, you risked unleashing a century's worth of secrets and sweaters. Victorian households had a dirty little secret, literally. While their parlours twinkled with polished mahogany and their doilies fluttered like decorative butterflies sent from heaven, the smell inside these homes was not heavenly. In fact, it often hovered somewhere between burning regret or damp anxiety and something died but we're pretending it didn't. You might imagine Victorian homes as genteel sanctuaries full of rosewater and lavender sachets. And yes, there was rosewater. There were sachets. But both were working overtime, like scented mercenaries, desperately trying to mask the scents of sewage, smoke, sweat, spoiled food, wet wool, industrial fumes, and the eternal ghost of cabbage. Let's begin with the biggest culprit: coal smoke. The unofficial perfume of the 19th century. Coal powered everything: lamps, fires, ovens, stoves, water heaters, and Virginia the parlour cat's favourite napping spot. Coal soot drifted through the streets, slipped under doors, crept into curtains, and settled onto every surface like an uninvited relative who refused to leave. Victorian families tried to disguise it with lace curtains, but lace is no match for the combined forces of industry and atmospheric grime. At best, lace politely said, "I've tried," and then turned a shade of dingy grey. Fires, the heart of the Victorian home, contributed their own fragrance to the mix. A good fire produced a comforting glow and the faint scent of burning wood. A bad fire produced smoke spirals, panicked coughing, and the unforgettable aroma of soot-infused upholstery. Since ventilation was more theoretical than functional, the smoke lingered, clinging to curtains, carpets, and your grandmother's favourite shawl until everything smelled like it had been slow-cooked inside a chimney flue. But the real champion of Victorian smells was not smoke, it was sewage. The Victorian sewage system operated on optimism and guesswork. Pipes cracked, drains blocked. Human waste had an aggressive habit of travelling in directions it was never meant to go. It bubbled up into courtyards, seeped into basements, and occasionally made unwelcome appearances in kitchens like the world's worst dinner guest. Inside homes, the problem was compounded by the absence of bathrooms. Even well-to-do families relied on chamber pots, those porcelain bowls of nocturnal mystery. Chamber pots lived under beds, behind screens, or in shared washrooms, patiently waiting for their moment to horrify someone. In the early morning, maids collected these pots and carried them out for disposal. Now imagine this: a teenager, half awake, walking down narrow corridors with several open containers of warm reality sloshing around. If you think your Monday mornings are rough, spare a thought for the Victorian chambermaid whose entire existence was a balancing act between dignity and disaster. Even after emptying, the pots lingered with a distinct aroma, no matter how much vinegar, boiling water, or industrial-strength denial was used to clean them. Guests pretended not to notice. Hosts pretended they didn't own bodies. Everyone participated in the grand social fiction that chamber pots were hygienic and odourless. Then there was the kitchen, the aromatic underworld of the home. Victorian food storage was ambitious. Refrigeration didn't exist, so leftovers lingered longer than good sense allowed. Meat was kept cool by hanging it in breezy places, which was fine until breezy places became warm, and warm places became the birthplace of smells that could knock a grown man unconscious. Milk soured quickly. Fish announced their presence before they even entered the door. Vegetables wilted into mushy puddles of disappointment. Meanwhile, cooking itself filled the home with potent aromas: boiling cabbage, frying herrings, stewed onions, burned pastry, and the eternal scent of something simmering that no one could quite identify. Victorians loved elaborate recipes but did not love ventilation. As a result, kitchens often smelled like a cauldron of tragic choices. But perhaps the most pervasive scent in Victorian homes came from wet wool. Everything was wool. Coats, blankets, shawls, underclothes, carpets, even the dog probably wore something woolen. And since Britain's weather specialised in being damp, every piece of fabric in the home was perpetually a little moist. Wet wool has a very specific aroma: warm, earthy, slightly sheep-like, and entirely unforgettable. It seeped into hallways, lingered in stairwells, and joined forces with the coal smoke to form something truly formidable. Victorians tried to fight back: scented oils, pomanders, incense sticks, herb bundles, linen sprays. The arsenal was vast. Ladies of the house tucked lavender sachets into drawers, hung dried flowers from rafters, and sprinkled perfume into wash basins. But none of these solutions could fully defeat the combined smell army of sewage, smoke, panic-boiled cabbage, and damp textiles. So what did they do? They covered everything with their doilies: doilies on tables, doilies on armrests, doilies on chairs that were already covered in fabric, doilies under figurines, doilies beside lamps, doilies lurking under vases like scented shields. The Victorian faith in lace borders was unshakable. And then there were the heavy curtains, thick enough to block light, sound, and possibly moral corruption. These curtains absorbed smells like sponges and held them hostage. Lifting a Victorian drape was a sensory gamble. Maybe lavender, maybe last week's fish, maybe something that had no name in the English language. Yet for all this, the home was expected to appear clean, refined, beautiful, and in photographs and parlours it did. It looked perfect, it sparkled, it shined, and it smelled like a chimney that had gotten into a fistfight with a sewer. Victorian households mastered the art of looking pristine while waging a daily invisible battle against the aromas of 19th century life. They couldn't escape the smells, but they could pretend the smells didn't exist. Decorative perfection on the outside, industrial regret on the inside. Victorian Britain was obsessed with appearances, but if there was one thing they wished would never appear at all, it was laundry. Laundry wasn't simply a chore. It was a public embarrassment, a moral dilemma, a logistical nightmare, and a weekly event that tested the strength of fabrics, furniture, servants, and the human soul. Victorians hid their dirty laundry the way governments hide classified documents, because nothing revealed the messy truth of a household faster than a pile of socks with opinions. To modernise, laundry is just another mildly annoying task. But in the 19th century, laundry was a multi-stage, physically punishing half-domestic, half-industrial ordeal that consumed entire days, flooded homes with steam, and left everyone questioning their life choices. Washing day wasn't merely labour. It was warfare. The enemy? Dirt. The battlefield? Your entire backyard, kitchen, and possibly the neighbour's fence, depending on how desperate you were. Let's start with the basics. Victorians did not want anyone to know what they wore underneath their clothes. Laundry, particularly undergarments, was socially sensitive territory because it revealed things Victorians pretended did not exist, such as sweat, bodily functions, and the fact that human beings were not perpetually fragrant porcelain dolls. Displaying your washing publicly risked exposing the family's intimate unmentionables to the neighbourhood, which in Victorian logic ranked only slightly below treason. For this reason, laundry day required secrecy, scheduling, and strategic planning. Households often designated specific days when laundry could be hung without arousing curiosity, typically early weekdays when respectable neighbours were least likely to peer over the garden wall with judgmental eyebrows. Even then, many homes dried clothes indoors, transforming kitchens into humid jungles of steam, dripping garments, wheezing stovepipes, and damp wool that stuck to walls like emotional trauma. The actual process of washing clothes was a saga. It began the night before, when items were soaked in tubs of cold water mixed with soap shavings, soda crystals, or the mysterious substance known as bluing, which apparently convinced white fabric that it was still white. By dawn, the scullery maid or laundress was knee-deep in boiling water, wringing cloth and praying for mercy. Every step was physically grueling, stirring scalding tubs, scrubbing garments on wooden boards, lifting heavy pots, and twisting sheets with the force of a competitive athlete. And remember, Victorian clothing was built like fortresses. Layers, petticoats, corset covers, detachable collars, stockings, shirts, bodices, aprons, washing it all required the kind of stamina usually associated with mountain climbers. Linen alone could weigh as much as a full bucket of water, and shirts stiff enough to stand upright on their own had to be beaten into softness with wooden paddles. Laundry wasn't cleaning, it was combat. The drying stage was even more challenging. If you were lucky enough to have a yard, you strung lines between trees or poles and hoped the weather cooperated. But Victorian weather almost never cooperated. Rain, fog, soot, random gusts of industrial dust. Everything seemed to conspire against freshly washed garments. A sudden shower could turn hours of work into a soggy tragedy. A passing factory belching soot could leave your linens looking like they'd spent the night rolling through a chimney. Indoor drying was no easier. Clothes were draped over racks, chairs, doors, and anything that could hold weight without collapsing. Kitchens became tropical rainforests, fogged with steam and the faint smell of wet flannel. The windows dripped condensation. Floors grew slippery. The air felt thick enough to swim through. Visitors entering on wash day often reacted like explorers discovering a new climate zone. Ironing was another epic battle. Irons were heated on stovetops, which meant too cold and they did nothing, too hot and they scorched fabric into unwearable lace-edged charcoal. Servants tested the temperature by spitting on the iron's surface. If it hissed, it was ready. If it produced a scream-like shriek, it was probably dangerous. Ironing required precision, stamina, and a deep belief that sleeves should lie flat even if the universe disagreed. All of this misery made laundry so shameful that families rarely discussed it. A tidy home with no visible laundry implied effortless domestic success. A home seen drying undergarments in the yard implied things Victorians refused to admit happened to the human body. So they hid their laundry under tablecloths, behind folding screens, under beds, inside airing cupboards, or even behind heavy curtains. Even magazines of the era carefully avoided featuring laundry scenes. Instead, they published illustrations of serene housewives arranging flowers or reading poetry, because nothing said proper womanhood, less than a depiction of someone stirring a vat of boiling underpants. And yet, despite the secrecy, laundry day was impossible to hide completely. Neighbours sniffed the air and knew exactly what was happening. The scent of boiling soap, damp fabric, and social discomfort drifted through narrow streets like a weekly confession no one wanted to make. Laundry was the great Victorian paradox, essential to maintain social respectability, yet simultaneously considered too indecent to be acknowledged openly. It was important, horrifying, exhausting, and humiliating. Laundry didn't just clean your clothes, it fought for its life. And often lost. If you've ever wondered where Victorian families hid the things they didn't want society to see, the answer is simple: the spare room. That innocent-sounding phrase conjures images of neatly made beds and decorative pillows that no one is allowed to touch. But in Victorian Britain, the so-called spare room was less a guest sanctuary and more a dimensional pocket where chaos went to vacation. The spare room was the domestic Bermuda Triangle. Items disappeared into it regularly, and sometimes people did too. Victorian homes were full of rigid order and public performance, but the spare room was where the mask slipped, a place where the truth was stored under a blanket and the door kept aggressively shut. Let's start with the clutter, because Victorians were collectors at heart. They amassed furniture like doomsday preppers amass canned goods. They collected chairs, side tables, trunks, hat boxes, spare linens, seasonal garments, umbrellas, forgotten toys, old holiday decorations, broken lamps, sentimental objects, discarded hobbies, and whatever the previous generation left behind when they retired to the countryside or the grave. Where did all this go? Into the spare room, of course, the house's unofficial goblin vault. Victorians were deeply sentimental about objects, but also deeply ashamed of mess. So the spare room became the compromise, a place where you could store endless family heirlooms without having them judged by guests. Furniture that didn't match the parlour, spare room. Half-finished cross-stitch embroidery that someone abandoned in 1869, spare room. A box full of your uncle's mysterious letters that no one's brave enough to read, spare room. The spare room was like the family's subconscious. Everything they refused to deal with went straight into it. But clutter wasn't the only inhabitant. Spare rooms frequently moonlighted as secret bedrooms, offering refuge for relatives whose presence was, shall we say, socially inconvenient. If a cousin was between jobs, recovering from nerves, not quite right in the head, or simply too dramatic for polite conversation, they quietly drifted into the spare room like a Victorian house ghost. These relatives often emerged only at odd hours, drifting through the hallways in shawls and woolen slippers, avoiding guests like Victorian cryptids. Visitors would ask, "Who was that figure in the hallway?" And the host would reply, "No one. Absolutely no one." Which meant, of course, that's Cousin Edgar, please don't make this complicated. Victorian society had a special talent for hiding what made them uncomfortable, and inconvenient relatives were at the top of the list. The spare room became a socially acceptable holding cell for anyone whose presence complicated the family narrative. Unmarried aunts, widowed sisters, travelling cousins, aspiring poets, melancholic nephews, all found themselves temporarily or permanently stationed in these shadowy chambers. And then there were the shameful storage items, the embarrassing clothes no one wore anymore, the awkward hat that looked better in theory than in reality, or father's old suit that smelled faintly of despair and mothballs. Spare rooms were filled with things that once had value, or might have value someday, or had the emotional weight of memories that no one wanted to confront. Victorian houses didn't have modern closets. Wardrobes and trunks did the job. But wardrobes filled up quickly, trunks even faster, and so the spare room became the default warehouse. Some spare rooms were packed so densely with objects that they resembled archaeological sites. Excavating one might uncover relics from 3 generations back, a lost sock colony, or a taxidermied bird that startled you into believing in ghosts. Yet despite their monstrous messiness, spare rooms had to remain plausibly presentable, just in case a guest unexpectedly needed a place to lie down after fainting, swooning, or overheating under 12 layers of fashion. Thus, families perfected the technique of surface tidiness, throwing a quilt or tablecloth over a mound of belongings and pretending it was a piece of furniture. Entire chairs vanished under drapery. Boxes disguised themselves as footstools. A stack of trunks became a respectable side table. Victorian interior design was basically 50% illusion and 50% prayer. Unsurprisingly, children loved spare rooms. These spaces felt enchanted compared to the controlled perfection of parlours and hallways. Spare rooms were dim, musty, full of secrets, and thrillingly forbidden. Sneaking into one was like entering a museum curated by someone with emotional baggage. Children found old letters, dusty hats, deflated cushions, discarded toys, and sometimes an actual human relative who had claimed the room before they were born. For the adults, however, the spare room was a silent shame. They avoided mentioning it. They avoided opening it. They avoided thinking about it. But when the house needed to look perfect, when neighbours or suitors or distant cousins were scheduled to arrive, the spare room became the receiving end of frantic cleaning campaigns. Hallway clutter? Spare room. Books piled on the table? Spare room. Someone's half-finished mending? Spare room. The spare room was the Victorian equivalent of a browser window full of tabs, essential, overwhelming, and always one click away from collapse. Thus the untidy room myth was born. Families whispered excuses like, "Oh, don't mind that room, it's just being reorganised," which meant they had shoved 38 objects into it 2 minutes before the doorbell rang. Victorians excelled at maintaining the illusion of household order, and the spare room was their greatest ally, or their greatest accomplice. It was a storage room, a sanctuary, a hiding place, a family vault, and a containment unit for emotional and physical mess. If you didn't know where something or someone had gone in a Victorian home, check the spare room. The Goblin Vault never lied. Victorian parents didn't just raise children, they manufactured miniature adults with the seriousness of people assembling moral machinery. Childhood was not a whimsical time filled with play, discovery, or emotional growth. No, Victorian childhood was an extended job interview for adulthood, complete with strict schedules, harsh supervision, and a catalogue of rules so long it could flatten a child if it ever fell off the shelf. Victorian parents believed children were born as little bags of potential chaos, ready to make mistakes, spill ink, or express opinions. All extremely dangerous behaviours. Their job, therefore, was to shape these fragile beings into respectable citizens by stamping out anything resembling childishness. The result? Children walked through life like tiny diplomats, desperately trying not to violate the Geneva Convention of Victorian household behaviour. Let's start with the rules, the endless, suffocating rules. Victorian children had more regulations than a tax office. They couldn't slouch, couldn't speak loudly, couldn't look bored, couldn't run indoors, couldn't run outdoors either. Running was suspiciously joyful. Couldn't ask too many questions, couldn't complain, couldn't interrupt an adult, couldn't touch the furniture, couldn't touch each other, and couldn't touch anything that might possibly be breakable. Dirty, decorative, or worth more than a month's wages. Basically, they existed in a state of continuous caution, like tiny museum visitors terrified of setting off an alarm. And then there was discipline. Corporal punishment wasn't just accepted, it was considered a crucial tool in shaping a child's future character. A child who misbehaved might be spanked, whipped, caned, tapped with a birch rod, or sent to stand in a cold hallway until their moral compass thawed. Victorian parents believed that physical correction was as beneficial as vitamins. A child who hadn't been punished at least once a week was considered under-seasoned. But discipline wasn't only physical. Victorians developed a stunning variety of creative punishments that didn't leave bruises, but definitely left emotional dents. Children might be forced to sit in total silence for hours, copy moral passages from books, wear uncomfortable posture-correcting devices, or kneel on hard surfaces while reciting apologies in poetic form. One popular method was the bread and water dinner, which sounds like something prisoners endure, not children who forgot to say thank you. Victorian parents didn't hate their children, they simply believed that kindness could ruin them, affection could soften them, and fun could lead them down the slippery slope to becoming circus performers or, even worse, poets. So instead, they expressed love through structure and discipline, convinced they were building strong future adults who would thank them someday. Education was another battlefield. Children studied from dawn until exhaustion, memorizing everything from geography to multiplication tables to moral stories where misbehaving youths met tragic fates, often involving drowning or near-fatal scolding from authority figures. Victorian lesson books were like miniature horror stories designed to terrify children into good behaviour. Forget subtext. These books straight up told kids, if you steal apples, you will either fall into a river or catch a terrible disease. Don't test us. School wasn't much better. Many children attended strict academies where teachers wielded canes, rulers, and an unshakable belief in memorization. Playtime was minimal. Smiling at the wrong moment could get you detention. The goal wasn't to help children learn, it was to help them control themselves. Education was a moral workout disguised as a classroom. Of course, some Victorian children were raised with a more gentle hand, but even these homes operated under the belief that children existed for the future, not the present. Childhood was something to survive, not enjoy. Parents meticulously monitored their children's behaviour like they were watching crystallised experiments unfold, with the expectation that one bad influence could cause the whole thing to collapse. Victorian parenting manuals didn't help. Guides for mothers and fathers instructed parents to keep children quiet, obedient, clean, respectful, and dutiful all at once. Children were encouraged to speak only when spoken to always defer to adults, and to hold their emotions tighter than a corset on Sunday morning. Even the concept of idle hands was considered dangerous. Idle hands led to mischief, and mischief led to the moral abyss. Thus, children spent their free time sewing, reading, practicing handwriting, or contemplating their life choices. Yet the most remarkable part, somehow, through all the rules, discipline, and rigid expectations, Victorian parents believed they were being compassionate. They thought they were giving their children the tools to climb the steep, unforgiving ladder of society. A well-behaved child reflected well on the family, and reputation meant survival. A misbehaving girl, even a small slip, could lead to gossip, shame, or the dreaded suspicion that the household lacked moral fortitude. Children, of course, rebelled quietly. Not openly, that was dangerous, but subtly. A stolen cookie here, a whispered secret in the hallway, a forbidden laugh during homework. Tiny rebellions that made them feel human in a world determined to mould them into upright statues. Victorian childhood was defined by love expressed through structure, affection translated into instruction, care delivered through correction. The good news? Victorian children were loved. The bad news? Their parents expressed it through rules, lots and lots of rules. Victorian households had a remarkable relationship with illness. They ignored it, not because they didn't notice it, trust me, they noticed everything, but because acknowledging sickness meant acknowledging imperfection, weakness, or, worst of all, social embarrassment. So instead of discussing illness openly, they politely buried it beneath layers of lace curtains, forced smiles, and the Victorian national pastime, pretending everything was fine when everything was absolutely not fine. The truth is, Victorian Britain was practically a petri dish with trains. Tuberculosis floated through the air like an uninvited party guest. Fevers visited homes more often than relatives. Mental illnesses were whispered about as though they were haunted spirits. And if anyone showed signs of chronic fatigue, dizziness, or melancholy, the official response was, "Just tired, dear," which was Victorian code for, "We're never speaking of this again." Let's start with tuberculosis, the era's most persistent housemate. Known as consumption, it was romanticised in novels as a poetic disease that gently whisked away delicate heroines while making them look tragically beautiful. In reality, it caused chronic coughing, dramatic weight loss, night sweats, and general misery. But because TB affected so many people, Victorians learned to conceal its symptoms behind closed doors, shielding the patient with privacy screens, thick curtains, and the unshakable belief that pretending helped. Family members tiptoed around the truth. Visitors were told the patient was feeling poorly or recuperating, vague, gentle phrases that suggested temporary inconvenience rather than an illness that could decimate an entire household. If coughing echoed down the hallway, servants quietly shut doors. If the patient grew weaker, the family simply revised the house schedule to avoid anyone noticing the empty chair at a dinner. Then there was hysteria, the medical catch-all diagnosis of the century. Victorian doctors used the term to describe everything from postpartum depression to anxiety, to trauma, to simply being a woman who dared to feel overwhelmed. Families, desperate to maintain social respectability, kept hysterical episodes strictly private. A daughter's panic attacks might be described as a nervous condition. A wife's emotional meltdown became delicate sensibilities. A son's breakdown after losing his job became overwork. The household strategy, a combination of rescuers, herbal tonics, absolute silence, and hoping the neighbours didn't hear the crying through the walls. If they did, the family simply pretended it was the wind. Mental illness in particular was an enormous taboo. Depression, mania, anxiety, hallucinations. None of these were considered medical issues. They were treated as moral failings, signs of shame, or burdens the household must hide to preserve dignity. Families concealed mentally ill relatives in spare rooms, attics, or recuperation homes, crafting stories about extended holidays, visits to the countryside, or the need for spiritual rest. Some relatives disappeared from dinner altogether, spoken of only in hushed tones, as though saying their names too loudly might summon social ruin. And what about chronic illnesses? Conditions like asthma, migraines, digestive disorders, anemia, and rheumatism were everywhere. And they were treated with a mix of stoicism, superstition, and secrecy. Pain was endured quietly. Faintness was brushed off as one of those days. Persistent coughs were explained away with creative excuses. It's the damp. It's the weather. Or it's the wallpaper. In fairness, some wallpaper was poisoning them, but acknowledging that would still be impolite. Victorians didn't have modern medical vocabulary, so they disguised symptoms with poetic understatement. If someone was chronically fatigued, they were delicate. If they suffered migraines, they had weak nerves. If they experienced depression, they were low-spirited. If they were experiencing a full mental collapse, the polite explanation was, they've taken to their bed. The pressure to appear healthy wasn't just personal, it was social. A sick family member meant missed work, lost income, higher expenses, and the terrifying possibility of gossip. Illness wasn't just inconvenient, it threatened the family's place in society, so everyone worked together to maintain a polished image. This is where the famed lace curtains came in. Lace curtains were not just decorative, they were symbolic, a boundary between the public facade and the private unravelling. Behind the delicate patterns, you might find someone coughing violently into handkerchiefs, a mother suffering from postpartum depression, a father bedridden with chronic pain, or a child recovering from yet another fever that medicine couldn't cure. Yet when visitors arrived, the curtains billowed softly. The parlour looked immaculate, and the family offered tea with impeccable manners. If the guest inquired after a sick relative, the response was always cheerful, regardless of how dire things actually were. Improving every day, they'd say, simply needing rest. In other words, we're not telling you anything. This culture of concealment created strange, ironic rituals. Families would stage short, choreographed health appearances where ill relatives were dressed neatly, brought downstairs for 10 minutes, and displayed like fragile decorative items before being ushered away again. The goal wasn't recovery, it was reassurance. Reassurance for visitors, for the neighbourhood, and for the family's own pride. Victorians lived in a world where illness was common, treatment was limited, and social judgment was brutal. So households learned to hide suffering behind propriety, politeness, and the comforting illusion that everything was under control. If someone said they were feeling a bit tired, everyone knew the truth. They were struggling, and no one was ever going to talk about it. Victorian families were obsessed with lineage the way modern people are obsessed with Wi-Fi, desperately dependent on it, constantly worried about interruptions, and prone to full-body panic when something threatened the signal. Respectability wasn't just a social goal, it was a family brand, a fragile structure supported by polished manners, good marriages, and absolutely no scandal whatsoever. Unfortunately, the Victorian family tree had other ideas. Beneath the polished surface of every respectable household lurked relatives whose hobbies included drinking too much, eloping with unsuitable partners, abandoning apprenticeships, joining suspicious political movements, writing embarrassing poetry, or simply existing with too much enthusiasm. These unpredictable individuals were the Victorian equivalent of a glitch in the system. Inconvenient, uncontrollable, and potentially reputation-destroying. Let's begin with the classic offender, the drunken uncle. He appeared at gatherings smelling like either brandy, regret, or both. He laughed too loudly, spoke too freely, and told stories that were absolutely not approved for mixed company. Children loved him. Adults prayed he wouldn't mention the time he lost all his wages betting on a horse named Moral Descent. Every family had one, and if they didn't have one, they borrowed one through marriage. Victorians kept these uncles at arm's length, which in practice meant seating them at the farthest end of the table, preferably next to an elderly relative who slept through dinner. If an uncle showed up unexpectedly, the household erupted into frantic cover-up mode. Hide the valuables, lock the liquor cabinet, close the curtains, and rehearse the polite explanations in case the neighbours saw him stumbling through the garden. Then there were the runaways, those dramatic family members who fled home at 17, leaving only a note that said something vague like, "I must pursue my destiny." These destinies typically involved stowing away on ships, joining travelling theatre troupes, moving in with unsuitable romantic partners, or reinventing themselves as amateur explorers in foreign lands. Victorian families reacted to runaways with a mix of shock, disappointment, and a determination to talk about them as infrequently as possible. If one of these adventurous souls returned years later, sunburned and suspiciously enthusiastic, the family welcomed them home with the warmth of people who had spent every day pretending they didn't exist. "Oh, how wonderful to see you," they'd say, while silently thinking, "Please don't mention the time you joined that questionable commune." Even more destabilising were the inconvenient cousins, the ones who didn't quite fit into Victorian society's narrow expectations. Some were loud, some were rebellious, some were hopeless romantics who kept falling in love with people who either lacked money, had too much personality, or worked in professions considered uncomfortably artistic. A few cousins were eccentric inventors convinced they could harness electricity to telepathically communicate with pigeons. Others were aspiring writers whose poems were so dramatic they made dinner guests choke on their dessert. Because Victorian families believed deeply in the power of appearance, these relatives were managed with extraordinary care. They were invited to family events only when necessary and closely supervised the entire time. Hosts deployed subtle manoeuvring, seating inconvenient cousins between two well-behaved relatives, redirecting their conversation whenever it grew suspicious, and praising their creative energies with the tone people use when complimenting a toddler's sandcastle. But the most scandalous relatives were those whose personal choices violated the Victorian rulebook. A cousin who eloped without permission, a brother who gambled away his inheritance, a daughter who rejected a socially advantageous marriage, or a niece who vanished from society for months before returning with no explanation except a mysterious smile. Families handled these crises the same way they handled smoke in the parlor, by quietly closing all the doors and pretending they smelled nothing. To prevent scandal from spreading, relatives were sometimes relocated. A troublesome nephew might be sent to stay in the countryside, translation, exiled until he learned self-control. A mother-in-law with a talent for gossip might be invited to visit relatives in Bath, translation, please stop telling everyone our business. A daughter who embarrassed the family might be given extended rest cures in an aunt's home 2 towns away. Translation, hide her until people forget. Victorians were masters of strategic omission. Family histories were edited like novels, awkward chapters removed, inconvenient characters written out of double, events rearranged to create a smooth moral narrative. If a scandalous relative could not be hidden, they were reframed. The gambler was unfortunate. The runaway was high-spirited, the drunken uncle was colourful, and the cousin with suspicious romantic adventures was free-spirited, in a tone that conveyed both admiration and terror. But the truth is this: Victorian families loved their scandals as much as they feared them. Behind closed doors, these chaotic relatives provided endless entertainment. Letters were exchanged full of breathless updates. Mothers whispered dramatic stories over tea. Sisters gathered in hallways to discuss the latest outrageous behaviour. And yet, when outsiders asked about the family tree, everyone smiled serenely and said, "Oh yes, we are a very respectable family." Every Victorian family tree had branches that curved in strange directions. Some bore fruit. Some sprouted surprises, and some produced that one uncle, the human equivalent of a plot twist. And no matter how polished the parlour looked, the family tree always had a few leaves they didn't want anyone to notice. Victorian Britain was a land obsessed with appearances, and nowhere was this obsession more painfully and privately felt than in household finances. Money was supposed to flow effortlessly. The father earned it, the mother stretched it, the servants spent it on groceries, and the home magically maintained its image of prosperity, refinement and sensible restraint. In reality, Victorian finances resembled a stage play held together by frantic whispers, creative arithmetic, and one piece of furniture more feared than the Bible and the physician combined: the locked desk. If the parlour displayed the family's public image, the locked desk protected the family's private disasters. Every Victorian home had at least one, usually stationed in the father's study. A fortress of polished wood with little drawers, hidden compartments, and a lock that symbolised authority, secrecy, and the quiet panic of overdue bills. Inside it lived the true story of the family's financial health, or lack thereof. Victorians lived in a world of economic instability disguised as stability. Businesses rose and collapsed faster than soufflés. Investments promised fortune but delivered migraines. Wages fluctuated, rent increased, unexpected medical fees arrived with the reliability of death and taxes. And yet families were expected to project an aura of calm prosperity, as though money materialised in drawers the same way lace antimacassars materialised on every chair. Let's begin with the fathers, the designated earners, or at least the designated actors playing earners. Many fathers lived in a state of constant financial anxiety, which they treated the same way they treated illness. They refused to talk about it. They kept ledger books no one else was allowed to see, paid bills in secret, and used coded language to soften the truth. Instead of saying, "We are drowning in debt," they'd say things like, "This quarter has been challenging," or "The economy is in one of its moods." Their locked desk drawers were stuffed with unpaid invoices, urgent notices from landlords, desperate letters from suppliers, and pamphlets advertising investments that promised miraculous returns if one were willing to suspend both disbelief and common sense. Fathers juggled these papers like a Victorian circus act, only instead of flaming torches, they used credit, loans, and enthusiastic optimism. One of the most common problems was overspending. Victorian society demanded appearances, and appearances cost money. Families spent on clothes, servants, furniture, dinner parties, school fees, charity events, holiday outings, and the never-ending parade of essential household items that magazines claimed every respectable home needed. If Victorians had been introduced to credit cards, the country would have collapsed within 20 minutes. Many households spent more than they earned not because they lived lavishly, but because the cost of respectability was ridiculous. It wasn't enough to be stable, one had to look comfortable. Looking comfortable required purchases. Purchases required money. Money required a business that didn't suddenly implode because a partner made one bad decision involving imported textiles and misplaced optimism. And this is where mothers quietly entered the battlefield. Mothers were the CEOs of household management, responsible for stretching the budget into shapes previously unknown to geometry. They tracked the cost of candles, coal, vegetables, soap, sugar, laundry services, tailoring, boot repairs, ribbons, and 12,000 small expenses no one appreciated unless they went missing. They kept their own locked boxes, smaller, daintier, often disguised as sewing kits or stationery cases, where they hid their household accounts from curious eyes. Why the secrecy? Because admitting the household was over budget was nearly as shameful as admitting the family owned fewer forks than their neighbours. Mothers maintained the delicate balance between what the family actually had and what society assumed they had. They learned to substitute ingredients, repurpose old dresses, rework leftovers into new dishes, and hide declining funds behind cheerful commentary. If a guest complimented a meal, the mother smiled graciously. She did not reveal that half the ingredients came from yesterday's disaster stew and the other half from a neighbour who owed her a favour. If the parlour curtains looked new, she accepted the praise without explaining that she had dyed them herself in the washroom after the original colour faded into moral uncertainty beige. Both parents created separate financial illusions, and both pretended the other was doing fine. This mutual delusion kept the Victorian household afloat, or at least gave it the appearance of floating while water leaked through every plank. When disaster struck, a sudden downturn in business, an unexpected loan coming due, or a costly medical crisis, the locked desk became a battlefield command centre. Fathers stayed up late, poring over columns of numbers like generals mapping troop movements. Mothers recalculated budgets with pencil nubs and deep sighs. Letters were written, deals negotiated, and contingency plans crafted. But none of this struggle appeared on the surface. Children were told absolutely nothing. Relatives received cheerful updates. Guests noticed no difference. And neighbours, blissfully unaware, continued to compare whose front steps were scrubbed more vigorously. The ultimate Victorian skill was pretending financial stability even while dangling at the edge of ruin. Families sold heirlooms discreetly. They pawned jewellery but claimed it was being polished by a trusted jeweller. They dismissed servants while insisting they were downsizing to encourage simplicity. They moved to cheaper homes by claiming the new neighbourhood had better air. Everything was a performance. Money didn't simply leave the wallet, it escaped, sprinting into the street while the Victorian household chased after it with a broom. Yet the facade had to remain. Poverty was feared not only for its hardship, but for the humiliation it brought. So the locked desk stayed closed, the budgeting stayed hidden, and the crisis stayed inside the home. The family might be one overdue payment away from ruin, but the world would never know it. Not if the Victorian locked desk had anything to say about it. Victorian dinners were legendary. Towering pies, gleaming roasts, jellies that trembled with dignity, puddings steamed to near geological density, and sauces poured with the solemnity of royal ceremony. Guests saw a meal that looked perfect. Guests tasted a meal that tasted mostly edible. And guests left remarking how splendidly the household manages its table. What guests didn't see was the battlefield that produced it. Victorian kitchens were chaotic universes held together by willpower, coal fires, and cooks who were one burnt pan away from declaring war on the oven. Everything in the kitchen operated on the edge of collapse. Recipes were unpredictable, temperatures were unstable, equipment was unreliable, ingredients were suspicious, and cooks were vastly overworked humans trying to produce meals that suggested serenity while experiencing culinary trauma. Let's begin with the greatest villain, the Victorian stove. Modern stoves offer precise temperatures, tidy controls, and the mercy of not trying to kill you. Victorian stoves, on the other hand, functioned like temperamental metal beasts. They heated unevenly, held grudges, burned fuel too fast, and created hot spots capable of turning pastry into charcoal within seconds. Cooks regulated the temperature using intuition, which in practice meant holding their hand near the stove and hoping they still had eyebrows afterward. These stoves caused catastrophes daily. Bread turned to ash, meats dried into shoe leather, sauces boiled over into volcanic eruptions that permanently scarred the pots, and tea, that sacred fluid, sometimes tasted faintly of smoke, frustration, and the emotional exhaustion of whoever brewed it. Then came the recipes, which were more suggestion than instruction. Victorian cookbooks assumed readers already knew everything, from how much salt to add, to how hot moderate heat should be, to how long until done lasted. A recipe might say boil the fish in the usual way, which is spectacularly unhelpful if you've forgotten the usual way or you're panicking because the fish is staring at you with one surviving eye. Some recipes were deeply optimistic. They asked for ingredients that were unavailable, unaffordable, or possibly mythical. Others assumed the cook had 10 spare hours, 17 pans, and the patience of a monk. Instructions for elaborate jellies sounded like spells cast by a magician who didn't care if you succeeded or summoned a demon instead. Now add the ingredient problem: spoilage. Food preservation in the Victorian era was, to put it kindly, a gamble. Meat spoiled quickly, milk turned sour overnight if the weather felt dramatic, eggs sometimes contained surprises, vegetables went limp, butter developed flavours that no one requested. Fish announced its decline from 3 streets away. Even flour could betray you, arriving with extra protein in the form of unwanted insects. Cooks battled this daily. They smelled, inspected, poked, prayed, and occasionally screamed. Some ingredients were salvageable after boiling, reseasoning, or disguising beneath gravy thick enough to mask entire crimes. Others were quietly buried in the garden while no one was looking. But the true heart of the kitchen, and the most overworked individual in the entire household, was the cook. A Victorian cook worked brutal hours, rising before dawn to set fires, prepare breakfast, oversee lunch, plan dinner, boil laundry water, render fat, bake bread, and produce dozens of small tasks that no one but she fully understood. By the time dinner rolled around, she had already lived an entire day. Guests praised dinners as though the lady of the house had somehow summoned them from thin air, never acknowledging that the cook had sweat into 17 pots, fought with the oven, negotiated with stubborn dough, and carried trays heavy enough to qualify as weightlifting. And the cook wasn't alone in her suffering. Kitchen maids scrambled between sinks, chopping boards and boiling pots. Scullery maids washed piles of dishes taller than their hopes. Errand boys ran through streets to fetch last-minute supplies because the household had discovered, always at the worst moment, that they were out of something vital. Dinner prep involved dozens of tiny crises. A roast might be undercooked, a pudding might refuse to sere, a pie crust might collapse, a sauce might curdle out of pure spite, a cat might steal a chop when no one was looking. A servant might slip, someone might drop the good china, and yet, despite all these unfolding disasters, the dining room had to look perfect, serene, and orchestral in its elegance. By the time the meal was ready, the kitchen crew was physically and emotionally destroyed. Meanwhile, upstairs, the family glided into the dining room as if nothing dramatic had happened. They offered dishes with pride. Guests complimented the scents. The hostess smiled like she had personally massaged every potato. But dinner didn't impress people, it threatened them. Victorian meals towered, jiggled, steamed, sizzled, and arrived with the silent implication: respect this or perish. And to all observers, the meal was flawless. No one knew about the burnt first attempt, or the meat dropped on the floor, or the sauce rescued from a near-death boil, or the pudding that spent 5 minutes refusing to leave the mould, or the fish that the cat almost made off with. No, all of that stayed in the kitchen, swallowed by the walls, the steam and the shame. Victorian dinners were triumphs not because they were perfect, but because they were served despite the kitchen being a battlefield of culinary chaos. Victorian romance was a lot of things, dramatic, rule-heavy, emotionally intense, but above all else, it was deeply inconvenient. Falling in love wasn't a private experience. It wasn't even a personal choice half the time. It was a social negotiation, monitored by parents, judged by neighbours, and scrutinised by anyone with eyes and free time. Respectable Victorian families treated courtship like a diplomatic mission. Every look, note, sigh, stroll, handshake, and dance step had to follow rules so strict they could qualify as federal law. And if two people dared to fall in love outside those rules, well, that's when the espionage began. The era's strict chaperone culture meant that no respectable young woman could be alone with a man unless the chaperone was watching closely enough to detect romantic thoughts forming in the air. This led couples to develop a romantic communication style that resembled military strategy. A simple conversation required timing, distractions, and usually a well-practiced manoeuvre involving standing near a doorway while the chaperone blinked. Because a Victorian chaperone didn't merely observe, she hovered, she patrolled. She listened to every word, every breath, every inflection. A man complimenting a lady's music might as well have confessing undying love. A girl laughing twice at the same joke was practically an engagement. Victorians didn't do subtle. They did scandalously obvious to everyone except the people pretending it wasn't happening. That's why secret letters became the lifeblood of forbidden love. Letters were the Victorian equivalent of romantic text messages, but far more dangerous. Every letter had to be written by candlelight, folded carefully, hidden immediately, and smuggled out of the house like illegal treasure. Couriers ranged from maidservants to siblings to bribed errand boys who were paid in coins, cookies, or the promise of future favours. Letters smelled faintly of perfume, panic, and wax. They were filled with flowery declarations. "My heart is yours until the moon ceases to rise." Coded references. "I admire your embroidery. We both know what that means." And the occasional frantic line because someone heard footsteps in the hall. Of course, letters were risky. Parents delighted in intercepting them. It gave them moral superiority and new gossip material. If a letter was discovered, the household erupted into drama, fainting, lecturing, crying, pacing, and the inevitable sentence, "This cannot continue," which was parent speak for "try again but be less obvious." But couples didn't stop. They got smarter. Victorians mastered the art of the coded glance, expressions that looked innocent but communicated entire romantic novels. A dropped handkerchief could be a declaration. A slightly prolonged handshake could be flirtation. A walk in the same park at the same hour every Thursday, practically an elopement. Because the greatest thrill of Victorian courtship was not the romance itself, it was getting away with it. Chaperone dodging became a competitive sport. Couples arranged accidental encounters in libraries, conservatories and gardens, always keeping an ear tuned for the chaperone's footsteps. Garden strolls were particularly perilous. The hedge maze was the Victorian equivalent of private time, but it was also where chaperones developed superhuman tracking abilities. If a couple wandered too far, a chaperone would appear, silently, ominously, inevitably, like a moral ninja emerging from a rosebush. But even worse than chaperones were reputations. Reputation controlled everything: marriage prospects, invitations, friendships, financial opportunities, and social standing. A single rumour could destroy a courtship faster than a telegram. If someone whispered that a young woman was too forward or a young man was too familiar, the family scrambled to bury the rumour with the efficiency of a crime syndicate disposing of evidence. Forbidden relationships could ruin everyone. Falling in love with the wrong person, the wrong class, income, religion, or profession sparked household chaos. Parents argued behind closed doors, letters were banned, meetings were prevented, cousins were recruited to spy. Even the household servants, normally silent observers, were sworn into the surveillance system by being asked, "Have you seen Miss Clara speaking with anyone she shouldn't?" And then there were the runaway lovers, bold souls who decided, "Let's elope and deal with the consequences later." Consequences included family exile, social abandonment, and stern disapproval from every relative over age 40. But some couples still did it, slipping away at dawn, taking the train to Scotland, and returning months later as an unavoidable fact the family had to accept. Less dramatic but more common was the parlor courtship, the only socially approved avenue. This involved supervised conversation, mild flirtation, strategically spaced chairs, and the occasional piano performance meant to showcase both musicality and marital eligibility. It was romance by committee, involving spectators, commentary, and widely shared opinions on whether the potential match was suitable. And yet, the heart wants what it wants, even in an era where feelings required permission slips. So Victorians developed their own underground network of love, hidden letters, renegade encounters, coded messages, nighttime hand squeezes, and long gazes across crowded rooms. These were the quiet rebellions that kept romance alive despite every obstacle society invented. If your Victorian romance didn't require secrecy, subtlety, or full-scale espionage, was it even real? Victorian love survived not in ballrooms or parlour interactions, but in the small stolen moments where two people dared to be human in a world that demanded perfection. Victorian Britain functioned on a giant unspoken agreement. Everyone must look morally perfect, even if absolutely no one actually was. During the day, Victorians walked around like polished examples of righteousness, polite voices, stiff postures, impeccable manners, and facial expressions that suggested they had never once experienced a sinful thought. But when the sun set, when the lamps dimmed, when the chaperones went home and the curtains were drawn, that's when the other Victorian world came alive. Because behind every respectable facade lurked a private life filled with small rebellions, questionable hobbies, secret indulgences, and enough hypocrisy to power the entire British Empire. Let's begin with the most classic double-life activity, drinking. Victorian society preached sobriety with religious enthusiasm. Publicly, everyone agreed that alcohol was the downfall of civilization. Privately, half of them drank enough gin to embalm themselves. Respectable men slipped into gentlemen's clubs in the evening, where they sipped brandy while discussing politics, investments, and the scandalous behaviour of people who were definitely no worse than they were. Some men claimed they drank only for their health. Others said it was for digestion. A few insisted, "It steadies my nerves," which was Victorian code for "I have no coping mechanisms." And all of them pretended that their flushed faces and suspiciously cheerful moods were just the effect of good air or excellent company. Then there was gambling, a pastime officially frowned upon in polite society but secretly adored. Cards, dice, horse racing, betting pools, Victorians gambled on everything. Some risked money, some risked reputation, some risked both, and then pretended they had misplaced their wages instead of losing them in a poker backroom to a man named Neville, with suspiciously perfect card shuffling skills. Young men gambled to prove bravery. Older men gambled to prove they still had it. Respectable gentlemen gambled because everyone else was pretending not to. And families prayed that no one noticed when a father arrived home unusually quiet, the universal sign of someone calculating how to explain missing funds to his wife without admitting he spent the evening losing to Neville again. Meanwhile, women lived their own secret lives, less publicly scandalous, but far more creatively concealed. Victorian women were expected to embody moral purity from morning to bedtime, but beneath the lace and respectability, many harboured secret hobbies, some of which would have caused fainting fits if known. Some women read novels considered too exciting for delicate minds. Others wrote poetry they hid under mattress covers. Some practiced sketching with live models, scandal. Many collected objects their husbands considered frivolous. Seashells, rare feathers, miniature figurines, sentimental postcards, even stones that felt emotionally significant. And then there were the women who practiced something truly outrageous, eating sweets in private. A respectable Victorian woman was expected to nibble, never devour, but in the privacy of their bedrooms or dressing rooms, many indulged freely. Sponge cakes, candied fruits, chocolate drops, and the era's greatest temptation, Turkish delight. The sound of a small box opening after midnight became its own secret ritual. The social pressure to appear perfect created a world where everyone was acting all the time. The man who lectured about temperance might secretly keep a flask behind his desk. The woman who spoke endlessly about modesty might own a drawer full of daring French fashion illustrations hidden between recipe books. The neighbour who attended church twice a week might spend evenings obsessively betting on horse races with the intensity of a Wall Street day trader. Victorian households even developed specific hiding spots for private indulgences. Desk drawers with false bottoms, sewing baskets with secret pockets, hollowed-out books that contained letters, coins, playing cards, or, in rare cases, a small bottle of suspiciously potent homemade alcohol. The double life grew even more dramatic in the cities. London, in particular, became a nighttime playground of secrets. After dark, respectable gentlemen slipped into music halls, dance clubs, and smoky taverns. Some attended underground theatres where performers flirted with danger and their audiences. Others went simply to escape the crushing weight of social expectations, to be imperfect without consequence. Even the most proper Victorians often maintained two wardrobes, one for daytime respectability and one for evening escapades. Daytime clothing said, "I am a sober, responsible citizen." Nighttime clothing whispered, "Let chaos bloom." But the greatest double life was not drinking, gambling, or eating sweets in secret. It was emotional freedom. Victorians were expected to hide their feelings as firmly as they hid their messy spare rooms. Grief, desire, frustration, joy, none of these were meant for public display. So people learned to express themselves in subtle, coded ways, in letters, in poems, in glances, in private journals that no one was supposed to read but absolutely everyone snooped through. The pressure to appear perfect created the society where deviation became irresistible. The stricter the rule, the more thrilling it was to break, secretly, quietly, dramatically. And so the average Victorian lived two lives, the one they showed the world and the one they actually lived. By day they were models of propriety. By night they were human beings with desires, flaws, and very questionable hobbies. Daytime, rigid posture, polite conversation, moral certainty. Nighttime, chaos with a top hat. Victorian society didn't just allow double lives, it practically required them. Victorian homes looked elegant from the outside. Orderly brickwork, neat windows, respectable rooftops. But step inside and you entered a maze of rooms. Staircases, doors, and suspiciously well-placed curtains that suggested one thing. Victorians were hiding something. Often they were hiding many things: mess, people, problems, wealth, lack of wealth, and the occasional regretful purchase from a travelling salesman. But to support this culture of concealment, Victorian homes developed an architecture so complex it makes modern floor plans look like stick drawings. These houses weren't designed, they were engineered, specifically engineered to let certain people move around unseen, to stash objects no one should find, and to create routes through the house that were more confusing than necessary. Let's begin with the most iconic structural secret, servant corridors, the Victorian home's built-in invisibility cloak. Servants were expected to perform essential tasks without being seen doing them. To achieve this, architects installed narrow hallways behind main rooms, running like hidden arteries through the home. These passageways allowed servants to move from kitchen to parlor to staircase to bedroom, without interrupting the family's delicate fantasy that the house cleaned itself. The corridors were cramped, dimly lit, and as welcoming as a long-abandoned mineshaft. Soft-soled shoes prevented noise, low ceilings prevented dignity, sharp corners prevented carrying trays with confidence. The corridors were so confusing that new servants required full guided tours just to avoid becoming permanently lost and having to start a new life in the pantry. Then there were the back staircases, which connected servant areas to upper floors. These staircases were narrow enough to promote humility and steep enough to promote prayer. Servants used them exclusively since it was scandalous for staff to appear on the main staircase. The glamorous carpeted one reserved for family, guests, and anyone the household needed to impress. The back stairs turned the home into a two-level social universe. One seen, one unseen. A respectable Victorian family could host a grand dinner while 30 feet behind a parlour wall, a cook sprinted up and down the back steps with the speed and desperation of someone fleeing a bear. Speaking of walls, Victorian walls were not always what they seemed. False walls were a surprising but useful feature in many homes. These weren't dramatic crawl spaces like in Gothic novels. More often, they were shallow voids created to hide structural beams, outdated wiring, or, more importantly, clutter. Some families used these hidden compartments to stash seasonal decorations, sentimental items, or the sort of embarrassing furniture gifts given by well-meaning relatives with terrible taste. You might open a panel and discover a forgotten stack of old newspapers, a box of letters no one wanted to sort, or the world's least attractive vase wrapped in 2 shawls and a layer of denial. But nothing rivals the hidden cabinets, which ranged from clever to downright suspicious. Victorians were masters of cabinetry. They built cupboards under stairs, inside walls, behind curtains, beneath window seats and under floorboards. Some cabinets hid valuables, some hid cleaning supplies, some hid alcohol in households where moral purity was loudly preached and quietly avoided. And some hid the kind of family secrets no polite person ever mentioned, old documents, odd relics, and once, according to several letters from the period, at least one taxidermied owl no one in the family could explain. Then there were the grand architectural enigmas, secret basements. Not all basements were secret, plenty were obvious, damp and full of potatoes. But in certain middle and upper class homes, there were extra basements, storage chambers tucked under the house like hidden layers of a cake no one wanted to cut into. These basements held coal reserves, pickling barrels, winter stores, tools, and occasionally relatives who'd been assigned the noble role of managing the lower rooms. Basements were also where the heating systems lived. Boilers, pipes, and mysterious metal contraptions that looked like they were invented by people who weren't concerned about safety. Some of these machines groaned, hissed, clanged, or exhaled steam in ways that convinced children and some adults that monsters lived below. And there's more. Victorian homes featured alcoves for statues, nooks for plants, window seats with storage underneath, wall-mounted curiosities, loft spaces accessible only by creaky ladders, and chimney voids large enough to store a lifetime supply of things no one wanted to sort through. It was as though the architect said, "Let's add another compartment every time someone sneezed." Why so many hiding spots? Because Victorian life required them. Respectability demanded a clean home. Families needed places to hide clutter quickly. Servants needed routes that allowed them to vanish. Storage was essential in a world without plastic bins, garages, or attics large enough to swallow everything. And society's obsession with secrecy meant that houses were designed to conceal people, objects, noise, and occasionally emotions. Imagine living in such a home. You could open what looked like a simple panel and discover a cupboard full of broken chairs. You could tap on a wall and hear the hollow echo of a hidden compartment. You could walk down a hallway and find 3 different doors, one of which led to a closet, one to a servant route, and one to a mysterious space containing umbrellas from 1843. Victorian houses weren't designed to be intuitive. They were designed to be strategic. A respectable home might look charming in the front hall, but behind the periwinkle wallpaper and velvet curtains lay an entire covert transportation system worthy of a spy film. Victorian homes had more secret passageways than a poorly designed video game, and every single one had a purpose. Some hid labour, some hid mess, some hid secrets, and all of them hid the truth of Victorian life, one concealed corridor at a time. Victorian Britain loved curtains, loved them with passion. To a modern viewer, the floor-length draperies and layered fabric seemed decorative, maybe even excessive. But to the Victorians, curtains were more than ornamentation. They were architectural Swiss Army knives, deployed strategically to hide flaws, manage lighting, conceal social embarrassment, and visually intimidate anyone who dared question the household's refinement. In a world obsessed with creating the illusion of perfection, curtains became the ultimate accomplice. Think of them as Victorian secret agents, silent, versatile, and always ready to cover something the family didn't want visitors to see. Let's begin with the most obvious use, curtains that hid windows. Victorians adored heavy drapes so thick they could block out not only sunlight but also hope, ambition, and any chance of ventilation. Why? Because sunlight had the audacity to expose dust, faded upholstery, suspicious stains, and the fact that some wallpapers aged into colours best described as melancholy yellow. During the day, curtains were manipulated with surgical precision. A gentle parting allowed just enough light to suggest warmth and prosperity, but never enough to reveal imperfections. Some families even layered curtains, sheer inner curtains for beauty, thick outer curtains for secrecy, creating a fabric sandwich around their windows. But windows were only the beginning. Curtains hid stains so effectively that you could almost hear them whispering, "Shh, no one needs to know." Victorian walls were prone to water leaks, soot streaks, mysterious marks no one wanted to explain. Paint cracked, plaster crumbled, wallpaper peeled. Instead of fixing these problems, which cost money, time, and admitting the house wasn't perfect, Victorians simply hung a curtain over it. No one questioned it. If a curtain hung suspiciously low, if it bulged slightly, if it was oddly placed in front of a perfectly flat wall, well, that was considered stylish. Guests simply admired the fabric and ignored whatever structural disaster lurked behind it. Curtains also hid cracks, which were a constant issue thanks to the era's enthusiastic but uneven construction practices. Houses settled dramatically. Floors shifted, ceilings sagged in ways that made homeowners consider prayer as a renovation method. A giant curtain could perform miracles. Draped across an entire wall, it disguised fractures large enough to qualify as geological events. But the Victorian mastery of curtains reached its peak with the boldest use of all: curtains that hid entire sections of the home. Some homes used curtains to divide rooms for privacy. Others employed them to conceal alcoves, awkward doorways, or shelves overflowing with items the household didn't have time to organise. But the most impressive strategy was using curtains to hide whole rooms that were either too messy, too broken, too cold, or too inconvenient to show. A curtain could conceal a cramped sewing nook, a disused pantry, a broken piece of furniture, or an entire passage that led to the servants' domain. This allowed Victorian families to pretend their homes were architecturally smooth, when, in reality, they resembled a well-dressed labyrinth. Think of the parlour. Grand curtains might hide the fact that a poorly placed door opened directly into the kitchen, risking the sight of servants rushing around like caffeinated ants. In hallways, curtains disguise storage recesses filled with boots, umbrellas, hats, tools, and the kind of forgotten belongings that accumulate when a society doesn't believe in throwing things away. Victorians didn't limit themselves to walls and windows either. They curated curtains around beds to hide the fact that people slept and drooled like mortals, bathing areas to keep hygiene rituals discreetly tucked away, drafty corners because insulation was more fiction than reality, bookshelves when a family owned fewer books than they claimed. Doorways, when the actual door was broken, missing, or simply unattractive. Curtains were so omnipresent that entering a Victorian home often felt like walking into a fabric obstacle course. Visitors navigated layers of drapery that brushed their shoulders, tickled their sleeves, and absorbed their dignity. Every curtain held a secret, sometimes charming, sometimes embarrassing, and occasionally alarming. One reason curtains became so essential was the Victorian obsession with privacy. This was an era that believed emotions should be hidden, desires should never be spoken aloud, and noises should be muffled by as much fabric as possible. A curtain wasn't just a textile, it was a moral barrier that prevented the world from hearing or seeing anything that didn't fit the family's curated narrative. In this sense, curtains acted as behavioural enforcers. If you can't see the clutter, it doesn't exist. If you can't see the broken chair, the house is still respectable. If you can't see the flawed wallpaper, you can pretend your decor choices were sound. Victorian households lived by one guiding principle. If the curtain covers it, society can't judge it. Of course, curtains had an unintended side effect. They confused guests. Victorians didn't believe in labelling things, so visitors never knew what a curtain concealed. Was it a window, a passageway, a bookshelf, a structural flaw, a door, a wall, a relative in disgrace? You never knew, and you rarely asked. Curtains weren't just decor, they were witness protection programs for walls. They sheltered imperfections, protected secrets, and ensured the illusion of the domestic perfection stayed intact. Behind the curtains lay the real Victorian home, untidy, unpredictable, beautifully flawed and human. But to visitors, the house was perfect, thanks to several miles of fabric doing heroic silent work. Victorian homes may have appeared spotless, polished and morally fortified, but beneath all that lace, furniture, polish and polite conversation lived an army of small determined creatures that Victorian households pretended did not exist. Because if there was one thing Victorians hated more than scandal, more than gossip, and possibly more than unpolished boots, it was admitting their home had pests. Publicly, pests happened only to unfortunate families, meaning families with less money, fewer servants, and a more realistic attitude about nature. But secretly, every household, grand, modest, tidy, chaotic, had at least one species of uninvited guest nibbling away at its dignity. Let's begin with the most persistent villain of Victorian domestic life, the flea. Fleas took one look at Victorian Britain, noted the abundance of carpeting, heavy drapes, wool clothing, and animals wandering indoors, and decided to settle down like it was the promised land. They feasted, they multiplied, they thrived. Flea bites were so common that scratching became a near-universal household activity, disguised under polite gestures like adjusting one's cuff or contemplating the wallpaper with vigour. But no one admitted it. A Victorian woman could be covered in bites from ankle to neckline and still insist her home was quite clean, thank you. Fleas were like inconvenient relatives. Everyone had them, everyone denied them, and everyone blamed them on someone else. Pets, servants, neighbours, the weather, anything but the carpets, which were basically five-star resorts for insects. Then there were bedbugs, which Victorians treated like a supernatural horror. Bedbugs lurked in mattresses stuffed with horsehair or feathers, crawling out at night like tiny monsters with impeccable timing. Their bites left painful marks, and their presence left emotional scars. A single bedbug sighting sent a household into silent panic. Of course, admitting you had bedbugs was unthinkable. A respectable family would rather confess to financial ruin than to an infestation. Instead, they quietly attacked the problem with boiling water, vinegar, hot irons, drying rooms, and prayers. Mattresses were hauled into yards under the cover of early morning fog, thumped, scrubbed, restuffed, and dragged back indoors before the neighbours could see. Next on the list, rats and mice, the true rulers of Victorian kitchens. Victorian kitchens were warm, full of scraps, lined with wooden cupboards, and constantly stocked with bread, flour, meats, and potatoes, in other words, rodent paradise. Rats snuck into pantries with the enthusiasm of dinner party guests. Mice dance behind walls, beneath floorboards, across shelves, and occasionally across someone's foot, which was always blamed on a draft. Rats were big enough to be noticed. Mice were small enough to be ignored. Both were treated with the same amount of denial. A family might hear scratching in the walls for weeks, but insist it was the house settling. If cheese vanished, it was misplaced. If droppings appeared, someone would say, with Victorian optimism, it must be soot. Households kept cats, of course. Cats were the era's quiet exterminators, patrolling rooms with the confidence of employees who know they will never be fired. A good Mauser was worth its weight in gold, but even then, no household could escape rodents completely. Rats adapted. Mice reproduced. Nature refused to respect Victorian social boundaries. And we cannot forget moths, the silent destroyers of clothing, carpets, curtains, and household peace. Victorian wardrobes contained oceans of wool and silk, perfect for moths looking to start large and prosperous families. Households battled them with lavender sachets, cedar chests, and the occasional loud accusation directed at the wardrobe, as though shame alone could repel insects. Moths were sneaky, nearly invisible, and devastating. A woman might open her trunk and discover her best shawl riddled with holes. A man might find his waistcoat reduced to a polka dot version of its former self. But instead of acknowledging moths, families describe the damage in artistic, mysterious terms. This fabric seems to have aged as in been eaten alive. Then there was the buzzing nightmare, flies. Coal smoke and open windows created perfect entry points. Kitchens attracted them, chamber pots attracted them, summer attracted them. In a world before modern screens, Victorian families spent half their warm weather days waving flies away with the newspapers, fans, or sheer desperation. But the most feared pest was something far smaller than a rat, less obvious than a bedbug, and more persistent than a flea, the household beetle. Beetles sneaked into flour, sugar, and dried goods. They hid in cracks and chewed through fabrics. They loved warm, dark hiding places, and Victorian homes offered thousands of those. Finding a beetle in the flour bin meant one thing: a full day of sifting, panicking, and telling the family that the bread turned out differently this week. Victorians lived in a constant state of low-level pest anxiety. But the era's obsession with respectability meant no one spoke of it aloud. Families preferred to maintain the fantasy that pests targeted only the poor, the careless, or the less refined. Meanwhile, middle-class parlours teemed with unseen life beneath carpets, in upholstery, behind walls, and inside the legs of ornate furniture. This is why Victorian homes were cleaned so relentlessly. Pests weren't just nuisances, they were moral judgments, tiny creatures that threatened the household's reputation with every chew, bite, and scratch. But even the cleanest homes couldn't escape them. No matter how polished the mantelpiece was, no matter how often the carpets were beaten, no matter how many sachets, sprays, or spellers a household deployed, nature always found a way in. Victorian homes were alive with activity, and tragically for the residents, it wasn't them doing it. Victorian Britain loved science, loved progress, loved rationality, innovation, and the thrill of intellectual discovery. But beneath that polished surface of logic and reason ran a deep, unstoppable river of superstition, swirling under every carpet, cabinet, and cup of week afternoon tea. Victorians prided themselves on being modern, and yet nearly every household secretly practiced rituals that would make medieval peasants raise an eyebrow. For every lecture about hygiene and morality, there were 5 whispered beliefs about ghosts, omens, curses, or charms that had to be tucked discreetly behind curtains so visitors wouldn't faint from second-hand embarrassment. Let's begin with the most beloved superstition: lucky charms. Victorian families kept charms everywhere, under pillows, above mantels, inside drawers, behind picture frames, and in pockets so deep they practically counted as an extra limb. Horseshoes were hung above doors for luck, open end up of course so the luck wouldn't pour out, a detail enforced with frightening intensity. A wrongly positioned horseshoe could spark a household debate that lasted longer than most marriages. The family Bible often hid pressed flowers, locks of hair, or tiny objects believed to ward off misfortune. Some households tucked coins beneath carpets on New Year's Day for prosperity. Others tied ribbons around bedposts, buried trinkets in gardens, or placed small stones in specific corners of the house to keep evil from settling there, as though evil were a particularly picky house guest. Then there was garlic, hung in pantries, kitchens, and occasionally bedrooms, not for flavour, but for protection. Victorian Britain wasn't particularly known for seasoning, so garlic's presence wasn't culinary. It was supernatural insurance. People hung garlic bundles to ward off illness, misfortune, ghosts, and, in a surprising number of cases, troublesome neighbours. A family might insist the garlic was for preserving food, but everyone knew what it was really for: defeating unseen forces with the power of herbs that smelled like social isolation. More dramatic families turned to rituals. Some whispered protective rhymes before bed. Some knocked on wood compulsively. Others circled objects 3 times for good luck or tapped their shoes together to prevent bad dreams. A surprising number of households kept salt in strange places, behind doors, under thresholds, in tiny bags sewn into children's clothing, because nothing said rational modern society quite like sprinkling salt on the floor to confuse demons. But superstition didn't stop with charms and rituals. Victorians were obsessed with omens, especially death omens. The sound of a clock stopping at midnight, terrifying. A picture falling off the wall, horrifying. A dog howling outside the window, absolutely catastrophic. A mirror breaking, start drafting your will. Victorian families wouldn't admit this publicly, of course. Out loud, they'd say something like, "What a curious coincidence." Inside their heads, sirens blared and panic erupted like a small domestic earthquake. Entire households operated under the belief that the universe was constantly trying to communicate with them through extremely dramatic symbolic gestures. Then there were the animal omens. A bird tapping on the window meant death. A black cat crossing your path spelled disaster, unless it didn't, depending on which region you came from and how much the cat liked you. A moth fluttering against a candle foretold doom. A raven sitting on the garden fence practically guaranteed it. But nothing beat the belief in the pigeon omen, a superstition so widespread that households occasionally performed rituals that today would raise serious questions. If a pigeon flew inside the home and died, which, given Victorian ventilation and architecture, happened more often than anyone wanted, some families placed the dead bird under the floorboards for good luck. Others buried it under the hearth. A few kept one feather as a talisman. Yes, respectable Victorian homes occasionally hid the remains of a pigeon inside the floor, and still ironed their curtains with dignity. One of the most fascinating aspects of Victorian superstition was how quietly it infiltrated daily life. A guest might enter a perfectly respectable home and never realise that under the hallway rug was a protective coin, or that the flowers on the windowsill were planted specifically to repel bad spirits, or that the heavy curtain in the parlour concealed a small charm hung to prevent arguments. Superstitions were woven into routines. Mothers whispered blessings over cribs. Fathers carried lucky pocket pieces during important business meetings. Children were forbidden from swinging their legs while sitting because it invited mischief. Visitors were asked to leave a house by the same door they entered through to avoid trapping good fortune. Even cooking had superstitions. Stirring counterclockwise courted disaster. Dropping utensils foretold visitors, and spilling salt meant trouble, unless it was immediately tossed over one's shoulder, ideally without hitting the nearest servant. Despite their devotion to science, Victorians were terrified of what they couldn't control. Disease, death, poverty, sudden misfortune. Superstition offered a sense of power, however imaginary. Installing a charm was easier than understanding germs. Readers of scientific journals could still pray that a fallen spoon wasn't an omen. Even the most rational Victorians had secret rituals they performed in moments of stress, doubt, or late-night fear. Superstitions weren't simply beliefs. They were coping mechanisms disguised as household decor. Victorian life was already full of pressure, rules, expectations and moral judgment. Adding the fear of curses, omens and supernatural consequences only made the stakes higher. But families clung to their rituals because they offered comfort, hope and the tiny illusion of control over the unpredictable world outside. Nothing showed the duality of Victorian society more clearly than this. A family could host a perfectly respectable dinner, quote science, praise progress, and then secretly hide a charm under the tablecloth just in case. Respectable on the outside, superstitious on the inside, and always one pigeon away from panic. Victorian Britain believed deeply in self-control, discipline, and moral uprightness. Publicly, Victorians prided themselves on being strong-willed, sensible, and fully in command of their emotions. Privately, they were drinking, swallowing, sipping, spooning, and dosing themselves into oblivion with an impressive assortment of quiet addictions. Because if there was one thing Victorians excelled at, it was suffering silently, with the help of whatever was in the nearest bottle. Let's start with the most socially acceptable addiction, tea. Tea wasn't just a beverage, it was a lifestyle, a ritual, a national identity, a coping mechanism, and sometimes the only thing standing between a Victorian and a nervous collapse. Tea soothed headaches, softened tempers, postponed arguments, and comforted anyone who wasn't allowed to openly express their feelings. Victorians drank tea when they were happy, sad, anxious, bored, faint, social, lonely, tired, or pretending they weren't tired. Tea was the era's emotional duct tape. And because caffeine is addictive, many Victorians were quietly dependent on their daily brew. But instead of calling it an addiction, they called it refreshment, poured it from silver pots, and insisted it was medicinal. But while tea kept people awake, something else helped keep them not awake. Laudanum, the Victorian cure for absolutely everything. Laudanum was a mixture of opium and alcohol, sold openly in pharmacies and taken for insomnia, headache, stomach pain, grief, irritability, boredom, heartbreak, mild discomfort, existential dread, and, in several cases, to calm one's nerves, which was Victorian code for the children won't stop screaming. It was cheap, strong, widely available and socially acceptable, at least in small doses. In larger doses, it turned people into sleepy Victorian ghosts drifting around their homes in slow motion. Entire households relied on laudanum in ways that would horrify modern medicine, but at the time it was as normal as aspirin. Many Victorian diaries include sentences like, slept poorly, took laudanum, dreamed vividly, took laudanum, felt low-spirited, took laudanum, which translates to, I am 1 teaspoon away from floating into another dimension. Then there were the tonics, bottles promising health, vigour, relief and miraculous transformations. Victorian tonics were the era's version of energy drinks, except instead of caffeine and vitamins, they contained alcohol, opium, cocaine, chloroform or mysterious botanical extracts that were definitely not approved by anyone with medical qualifications. Tonics advertised themselves with phrases like, restores vitality, soothes female troubles, recommended for ailments of the stomach, nerves, brain, lungs, bones and spirits, approved by 2 doctors and a clergyman. Victorians bought these with the confidence of people who wanted solutions but didn't care whether those solutions were science, sorcery or industrial strength liquor. One popular tonic was marketed specifically to exhausted mothers. Another was advertised as a gentle stimulant for businessmen. Gentle in this case meaning may cause hallucinations. Children were given tonics too, because Victorians loved giving children substances that modern parents wouldn't let near the family dog. And let's not forget alcohol, the quiet companion of unspoken sorrows. Drinking wasn't always public. Often it was done quietly, privately, and frequently behind closed doors. Respectable families hid bottles behind bookcases, inside desk compartments, or in the bottom drawer of the linen cabinet, labelled linen repairs for extra deception. Some men attended gentlemen's clubs, not for the company, but for the opportunity to drink something stronger than tea without judgment. Women, discouraged from drinking openly, took medicinal wines prescribed for nerves, digestion, or general weakness, which were often just very fancy ways of saying, you may drink wine at 2 p.m. without scandal, but only if you pretend it's for your health. But addiction wasn't always about chemicals. Some Victorians were dependent on habits they couldn't admit. There were individuals who fled into obsessive hobbies, bird-watching, fossil collecting, embroidery marathons, or cataloguing seashells with the seriousness of military strategists. Others found comfort in excessive reading, disappearing into novels for hours, because reality was a less stimulating genre. And then there were the emotional addictions. People addicted to writing letters. People addicted to shopping for trinkets. People addicted to overly dramatic self-reflection. People addicted to worrying about things that did not need to be worried about. Victorians didn't unwind, they dissolved. In tea, in alcohol, in laudanum, in tonics, in hobbies, in rituals, in whatever helped them endure life without publicly admitting that life was sometimes overwhelming. Addiction didn't always happen loudly. Sometimes it was as quiet as a teacup placed gently on a saucer, or as soft as the clink of a tonic bottle against a cupboard shelf. Households hid these habits well. The parlour displayed calm and propriety, but the real story lived inside drawers, medicine cabinets, kitchen shelves, bedside tables, and the occasional cardigan pocket. Everyone in Victorian Britain pretended to be perfectly composed, but behind the polished veneer, people coped in messy, human ways. The respectable family home wasn't just full of polished silver and moral virtue. It was full of coping mechanisms disguised as beverages, medications, and rituals. Because in a society that demanded emotional restraint at all times, sometimes the only freedom Victorians had was what they swallowed, sipped, or quietly reached for in the dark. Victorians adored pets, adored them passionately, proudly, and often recklessly. To the outside world, Victorian pets symbolised refinement. A well-groomed dog, a graceful cat, or a politely chirping bird indicated good taste and moral sensibility. But beneath the charming exterior and elegant paintings of ladies with lapdogs was a truth no one admitted out loud. Victorian pets were chaos, beautiful chaos, noisy chaos, occasionally dangerous chaos. Some families owned the usual animals, terriers, spaniels, fluffy cats who looked annoyed even in photographs. But others wanted something more exciting, something fashionable, something their neighbours did not have. This led to a trend that in retrospect seems ill-advised: exotic pets. Victorian travel increased dramatically, and with it the availability of creatures that absolutely did not want to live in a British sitting room. Monkeys, hedgehogs, tropical birds, lizards, imported fish, and sometimes animals whose species the household only vaguely understood. Zoos existed, yes, but many Victorians wanted something more personal, something they could show off at tea, something alive, unusual, and likely to terrify the servants. Let's begin with the most dramatic, the monkey. Monkeys were popular among wealthy households, mostly because no one stopped to consider whether a mischievous, hyper-intelligent animal belonged inside a room full of expensive china and emotionally fragile furniture. Victorian monkey owners often insisted that their pet was clever and amusing. Translation: it escapes constantly and destroys everything we own. Monkeys chewed curtains, stole jewellery, overturned ink bottles, raided kitchen shelves, bit ankles, and occasionally escaped into the neighbourhood, where they climbed drain pipes and traumatised laundry maids. One monkey famously disappeared for 2 days before being discovered in the neighbour's pantry, surrounded by crumbs, guilt, and the household's entire supply of biscuits. Then we have the elegant but deeply problematic parrot. Victorian parrots were not the sweet, cartoonish companions we imagine today. These parrots had powerful beaks, unpredictable moods, and an uncanny ability to mimic sounds you did not want them to mimic. They screeched during dinner. They swore when the vicar visited. They mocked the family's arguments with perfect accuracy. One parrot in Kent became locally famous for repeating the phrase, "Oh, bother it all!" at such volume that passing carriages assumed the house was cursed. Parrots also attacked hats, ears, table legs, and anything shiny. Families pretended the bird was vibrant or spirited, but behind closed doors they covered their fingers with fabric and prayed. But the most unexpectedly hazardous Victorian pet lived outdoors: the swan. Victorians romanticised swans as symbols of beauty and purity. They painted them, wrote poems about them, fed them breadcrumbs with trembling fingers, and then acted shocked when the swans behaved like miniature feathered dragons. Swans were territorial, aggressive, and frighteningly confident. They chased children, they bit ankles, they attacked boats. One swan in Surrey was notorious for knocking hats into the lake and refusing to give them back. But perhaps the most Victorian pet disaster of all was the exotic bird craze. Families imported birds from across the world, bright, exotic, impressive birds that did not appreciate the British climate nor the Victorian belief that everything should sit quietly on a perch. Some birds refused to sing, others screamed continuously. A few escaped through open windows and disappeared forever, leaving behind only a cage, a pile of seed husks, and an owner insisting the bird had gone on a journey. Victorian cats were also far from innocent. Despite their association with poise and grace, they often snuck into pantries, stole food, shredded sewing baskets, and left mysterious presents under furniture. Cats were beloved, but also widely blamed for broken objects, disappearing leftovers, and the general decline in household morale. Yet families insisted, oh, she would never do such a thing. Meanwhile, the cat was behind the sofa, plotting its next crime. Dogs, too, brought their own brand of havoc. Victorian dogs were often undertrained, overstimulated, and given names like Dash, Duke, or Flossie, names that implied dignity but rarely reflected the animal's true personality. Dogs chased delivery boys, barked at visitors, tore through flower beds, and occasionally ate things Victorian medicine books warned firmly against. And yet, because Victorians adored sentimentality, dogs were indulged, photographed, painted, mourned extravagantly, and described in diaries with phrases like, "His spirit was noble," ignoring the fact that the noble spirit had spent the morning rolling in something horrible. But the real secret hidden behind Victorian respectability was this: many households had pests, pets, and everything in between coexisting in a delicate, chaotic ecosystem. A monkey might chase a parrot might scream at a cat might terrorize a dog might bark at a swan might attempt murder, and yet Victorians pretended everything was serene. Visitors admired the household's darling creature, unaware that 5 minutes before their arrival, 3 servants were chasing the animal through the hallway, while the lady of the house prayed the parrot wouldn't speak during tea. Victorian pets weren't just companions, they were hazards, clowns, saboteurs, escape artists, feathered sociopaths, and furry anarchists. Beautiful, yes. Lovable, certainly. Predictable? Absolutely not. Respectable Victorian homes weren't as tranquil as they seemed. They echoed with barks, screams, crashes, flapping wings, tiny stampedes, and the occasional sound of someone shouting, "Someone catch that thing before it reaches the dining room," because in Victorian Britain, pets didn't live in households, they ruled them. Victorian Britain loved paperwork. Loved it so much, in fact, that they turned daily life into a forest-devouring ritual of ink, wax, folded envelopes, and carefully sharpened quills. Letters documented everything. Diaries documented everything else. Journals captured the secret everything else that even diaries were afraid to mention. And the result? Every Victorian home was filled with dangerous paper. Sheets and sheets of delicate, innocent-looking documents hiding thoughts, feelings, confessions, and catastrophes just waiting to be discovered at the worst possible moment. To understand the risk, you must first understand how Victorians wrote letters. Victorian letters were not like modern texts or emails. They were emotional marathons. A letter could be 5 pages of politely worded panic, 3 paragraphs about weather that somehow hinted at forbidden desire, or a neat collection of sentences arranged to conceal more than they revealed. People wrote dramatically, passionately, obsessively. No one simply wrote, "I miss you." They wrote, "My heart languishes in your absence like a frostbitten rose yearning for the sun's embrace." And that was just the grocery list. Letters served as love confessions, arguments, apologies, threats, tactical negotiations, and emotional vents. But because Victorian life was one giant performance, letters also served as a hidden record of everything no one dared say aloud, which made letters extremely dangerous. A single misplaced letter could ruin a reputation, end a courtship, ignite a family feud, or provide enough gossip to power an entire neighbourhood for months. Servants knew this, which is why they carried letters like they were transporting explosives. Family members knew this, which is why they guarded their correspondence with locked drawers, ribbon-tied bundles, and enough paranoia to fuel a spy thriller. Some letters were hidden in books, between mattress layers, in coat linings, behind picture frames, or in cabinets no one opened because the hinges squeaked suspiciously. Victorian homes were full of these secret stashes, miniature archives of volatile emotions preserved on delicate stationery. But if letters were dangerous, diaries were downright explosive. A Victorian diary wasn't a journal, it was a time bomb with handwriting. Victorians used diaries to express everything they didn't want the world to hear. All the complaints, forbidden passions, irritations, secret hopes, scandalous opinions, and deeply personal worries went straight into those pages. And unlike modern diaries, Victorian ones were written with the dramatic flair of people who spent their whole lives repressing emotions. A normal entry could read, "Mrs. Pembroke wore blue today. I hate her." Or, "Mother insists I marry Mr. Thompson. I would rather perish under a runaway omnibus." Or, "If the baby cries one more time, I shall flee to the seaside and never return." Diaries held private judgments, romantic longings, family secrets, financial anxieties, social resentments, and scandalous memories. Everything that would have gotten someone lectured, scolded, or socially exiled. This was dangerous for one reason: Victorians were nosy. Everyone read everyone else's business. Servants occasionally peeked. Siblings searched for ammunition. Mothers read their daughters' diaries for their own good. Husbands snooped. Wives snooped back. No one was safe. To protect their diaries, Victorians developed elaborate systems of hiding and deception. Diaries were locked inside decorative boxes, tucked beneath floorboards, wrapped in shawls inside storage chests. Disguised as recipe books. Some people wrote in code, others wrote in languages they barely understood. One woman famously wrote her diary entries backward, so no one else could read them without a mirror. A method that said both "I value privacy" and "I have too much free time." And then there were journals, a category separate from both diaries and letters. Journals were where Victorians recorded their biggest truths, their bold dreams, their quiet regrets, their unconventional opinions, their private fears, and their dissatisfaction with society. Journals held political rants, philosophical experiments, poetry no one wanted to read aloud, and introspection so dramatic it could set off emotional fire alarms. The danger of journals wasn't just their content, it was their permanence. A letter could be burned, a diary could be hidden. But journals became family heirlooms of doom. Generations later, descendants opened them and learned scandalous truths about their ancestors. Great-grandmother secretly loved someone else. Great-grandfather wasn't actually travelling for business. He was avoiding Aunt Margaret. Cousin Eloise eloped 3 times before anyone found out. Uncle Rupert hated the family dog. The parlour carpet's real pattern was not a mystery. Someone spilled ink and blamed it on fate. Victorian journals turned history into chaos. Households were so afraid of these revelations that many journals were burned immediately upon the writer's death. But some escaped destruction because relatives couldn't resist reading just one page, then another, then the whole thing, and suddenly the entire household knew secrets so scandalous they had to sit down, fan themselves, and never mention them again. The irony is that the Victorians, who valued privacy more than breath, left behind more written evidence of their thoughts than any era before them. They wrote their inner lives into existence, then spent their days pretending those thoughts didn't exist. Letters held their desires, diaries held their frustrations, journals held their truths, and all of it hid inside drawers, boxes and false cabinets while the household carried on as though nothing complicated ever happened. In a society built on appearances, paper became both the greatest confessor and the greatest threat. Victorian homes didn't just hide secrets in closets or basements, they hid them in ink, waiting for curious hands to turn the page. Victorians talked a big game about prosperity, refinement, and living comfortably, but behind the polished doors and polished manners lurked a quiet, frantic economy based on one principle. If it still exists, it is not trash. Victorian households reused everything, absolutely everything. Items were mended, patched, repurposed, refilled, disguised, stacked, hidden, and coaxed into surviving far beyond their intended lifespan. Only the wealthy elite could afford to throw things away casually. Everyone else practiced a form of resourcefulness that bordered on magical realism. Yet these same families obsessed over appearing prosperous. Respectability demanded elegance, and so an entire underground system developed. The clandestine art of reusing things so cleverly that guests never realized the household was two fraying hems away from admitting defeat. Let's begin with the most tortured item in any Victorian home: clothing. Victorian clothes looked luxurious. Lace trims, polished shoes, tailored bodices, decorative buttons. But if you peeked inside the seams of most middle-class garments, you'd find more stitching than fabric. Clothes were mended endlessly, socks were darned until they resembled knitted ghosts. Gloves were repaired so often they developed personalities. Shirts were patched with whatever scraps were available, sometimes discreet, sometimes wildly not. Dress hems were altered, tucked, re-hemmed and reinforced with layers of thread. A single dress might live 3 or 4 separate lives, getting reworked into new fashionable shapes as trends shifted. One season it's a full skirt, the next it's a trimmed-down walking dress. Later, after losing dignity, it becomes a house gown. Eventually it becomes a quilt square. Finally, after decades of service, the remaining fibres join the household rag pile. Not to rest, but to begin another career cleaning stove grates. Nothing truly died in a Victorian home, it simply evolved. The same went for shoes. Men's boots were polished so fiercely that they often outlasted the original leather. Women's shoes were patched, re-heeled, stuffed with cloth, or hidden beneath long skirts so no one would notice the embarrassing truth. Children's shoes, meanwhile, were passed down like family heirlooms, even if the soles were so thin they could feel the emotions of the pavement. But clothing wasn't the only thing repurposed with religious dedication. Victorians reused bottles like their lives depended on it. Glass bottles were refilled with vinegar, oil, perfume, ink, medicine, cleaning fluid, and sometimes the wrong substance entirely. Households kept bottles for years, decades, because glass was expensive. Many families possessed one bottle that held at least 5 different liquids over the course of its career. You could pour something out and genuinely not know what the last 3 contents had been. Victorian bottle labels were lies. Everyone knew it. This also led to hazardous mix-ups. Why does the soup taste like lamp oil? Because the bottle used for lamp oil once held pickles. Or maybe the other way around. Who can say? Then we have furniture, which was rarely replaced. It was repaired, reupholstered, repainted, restuffed, recarved, revarnished, and, if necessary, strategically covered with a decorative shawl that whispered, "Don't touch me, I'm fragile." Sofas sagged, chairs creaked, tables wobbled, but as long as the furniture remained physically upright, it was considered functional. Even carpets were reused until they resembled archaeological sites. When one area wore thin, that section was cut out, replaced with a patch, and rotated to a less visible part of the room. If a carpet became truly beyond repair, families overlapped it with another thin carpet, creating a layered system of textile denial. The kitchen embraced reuse with unmatched intensity. Jars were reused, bags were reused, bits of wax paper were washed and reused. The ends of candles were melted together to form new candles, though these often burned like frustrated ghosts. Every scrap of food had a destiny. Yesterday's roast became today's hash. The scraps became tomorrow's soup. The bones became stock. The stock became gravy. And the gravy covered up the fact that everything had been reused 3 times. But perhaps the most impressive reuse happened with household textiles. Curtains were remade into cushions. Old bedding became towels, towels became floor cloths. Floor cloths eventually became something you didn't talk about, but still used because throwing things away was immoral, unless the item physically turned to vapour. Victorians were environmentalists by necessity, not because they wanted to save the planet, but because fabric cost money, and money was a creature no Victorian household ever fully trusted. Meanwhile, all this reusing had to be hidden. Respectability required illusions. Guests weren't supposed to see the patched tablecloth hidden under a runner, the repaired hem stiff with 20 layers of thread, the sofa propped up with 2 books and sheer optimism, the teapot that had been cracked so many times it was more glue than china, the reused medicine bottle now pretending to contain vanilla extract. Victorian households performed their daily ballet of concealment. Everything worn, torn or borderline dangerous was tucked away whenever anyone remotely important visited. The good tablecloth emerged, the good plates appeared, the good cushions, unstained and slightly less lumpy, were arranged on the chairs. The illusion was complete, but behind closed doors, families counted pennies, recounted pennies, and then reused the same penny by pretending it hadn't already been budgeted. Victorian budgeting had only one rule: if it hadn't turned to dust yet, it was still good. Respectable families lived in homes full of ghosts, garments that refused to retire, bottles with confusing histories, furniture that should have been legally declared deceased, and textiles that were one wash away from becoming thread confetti. And yet somehow it worked. Victorians persevered through ingenuity, secrecy, and stubborn attachment to household objects. Every item served until it couldn't, and then it served again. Victorian Britain adored progress. It adored invention. It adored anything that promised to make life cleaner, brighter, warmer, or less exhausting. The only issue? Many of these inventions also had the unfortunate habit of exploding, poisoning, suffocating, collapsing, overheating, or simply catching fire out of spite. Victorian homes were filled with experimental conveniences, half of them miraculous, the other half deeply confused about whether they were supposed to help the family or eliminate it. Behind the respectable surface of innovation was a chaotic technological underworld, humming with hidden hazards that Victorians valiantly pretended were completely safe. Let us begin with the deadliest diva of Victorian home technology, the boiler, a time bomb in the basement. Boilers were advertised as modern marvels, sleek in theory, efficient rarely, and designed to bring warm bath water to the respectable middle class. But boilers had one major design flaw. They absolutely loved exploding. A Victorian boiler could turn on you faster than a swan with a grudge. Temperature gauges were primitive. Pressure valves jammed, pipes cracked. And because heating water required open flames and guesswork, boilers often became aggressive metal kettles capable of punching holes through walls. Victorian newspapers regularly ran headlines like, "Boiler catastrophe at number 14. Bathing disaster causes roof damage. Family saved by unusually alert cat." Every household insisted their boiler was perfectly safe while also giving it the wary respect one normally reserves for wild animals. Servants lit the boiler like they were defusing a bomb. Household members stood far back. Even the dog eyed it suspiciously. The boiler might have been modern, but the fear was ancient. Gas lamps, beautiful, bright, and slightly murderous. Gaslighting transformed Victorian life. Rooms became brighter, evenings longer, and everything looked more elegant. Unfortunately, I'd say gas lamps came with several side effects such as gas leaks, gas poisoning, sudden fireballs, walls becoming soot sponges. The occasional small explosion gas lamps hissed ominously. They flickered. They produced heat strong enough to warp furniture. They smoked if you looked at them wrong. And if the flame burned inefficiently, it produced carbon monoxide, an invisible, silent roommate who never paid rent and occasionally killed people. Families told guests proudly, "We have gaslighting now," while also cracking windows, sniffing the SO air repeatedly, and warning the children not to breathe too enthusiastically. Servants hated gas lamps most of all because lighting them required balancing on ladders with a flame in one hand and dread in the other. The stove, a metal beast with mood swings. Victorian stoves did not simply cook food. They roasted, smoked, charred, scorched, and occasionally, due to malfunctioning vents, tried to suffocate the family. Coal-fired stoves had 3 settings: too cold, too hot. Personal revenge. The temperature control system consisted entirely of intuition, prayer, and opening the door to see if the flames looked angry. Sometimes the stove overheated and melted pans. Sometimes it underheated and delivered half-cooked meals that deeply concerned guests. Sometimes sparks shot out like the stove was trying to start a rebellion. Families called these mishaps quirks. Servants called them attempted homicide. Poison wallpaper, the silent killer with lovely aesthetics. Imagine decorating your parlor with lush green wallpaper made with arsenic pigment, only to realize later that it slowly poisons the air, flakes into dust, and gives everyone headaches, rashes, or Victorian-style mystery illness. Yes, arsenic wallpaper was a thing, a beloved, fashionable, highly toxic thing. Rooms covered in arsenic wallpaper had atmospheres so poisonous they could wilt flowers. Children sometimes fell ill for vague, inexplicable reasons. Guests grew dizzy, servants coughed. No one suspected the wallpaper because it looked fabulous. Doctors warned people, newspapers wrote about it, chemists raised alarms. Victorians replied, "Yes, but the green is so rich." Some families replaced their wallpaper. Others doubled down, adding curtains and carpets that matched their stylish death trap. Respectability had no time for safety, the unstable plumbing pipes with attitude. Victorian plumbing promised convenience, water on tap, no more hauling buckets, dog. But Victorian pipes were not built for reliability. They froze in winter. They burst unexpectedly. They leaked into ceilings. They groaned like haunted wind instruments. And because early plumbing involved a mix of guesswork and that should be fine, pipes often routed waste in directions it absolutely should not have gone. Some households had sinks that backfired. Others had mysterious odours no one wanted to trace. A few had entire sections of plumbing that simply stopped working and were quietly abandoned like embarrassing cousins. Electric bells, useful until they summoned panic. Many Victorian middle-class homes installed electric servant bells, cutting-edge technology meant to summon service with a simple button. These bells malfunctioned constantly. They rang by themselves. They refused to ring when actually needed. They rang all night like poltergeists performing percussion solos. Some servants thought the house was haunted. Some households blamed wires. Some blamed electrical spirits. Some blamed the butler. The real culprit was wiring so poorly insulated it probably crackled every time someone sneezed. Innovation or indoor survival challenge. Victorian technology was ambitious but temperamental. Every device had the power to impress your guests or endanger your life. Families boasted proudly about their modern conveniences, then whispered warnings, gave lengthy safety instructions, and kept buckets of water nearby. Victorian innovation didn't make life easier. It made life shorter, but it also made life exciting in the sense that every day carried the thrill of possibly being electrocuted, poisoned, suffocated, or set aflame by your own home. And in true Victorian fashion, everyone pretended nothing was wrong. Victorian Britain prided itself on being civilised, refined, dignified, emotionally composed, a place where public behaviour mattered more than breath, and the goal of every encounter was to maintain an appearance of harmony, even while your internal monologue was planning a 16-step revenge strategy involving tea, social rumours, and strategic flower arrangements. Because behind the facade of polite conversations and gentle nods existed a world of rivalries so intense they could have fueled entire chapters of a Dickens novel. Victorian feuds weren't loud, they weren't dramatic, they certainly weren't direct. No one raised their voice, no one threw things, no one stormed off in a rage. No, Victorian feuds lived in the quiet crevices of conversation, in carefully chosen phrases, in the angle of a curtsy, in the offering of a slightly stale biscuit, or in the deliberate withholding of a warm greeting at church. Victorians didn't fight openly, they weaponized politeness. The polished smiles that could kill. Imagine two Victorian neighbours meeting at the garden gate, both smiling, both friendly, both absolutely despising each other with the passion of 1,000 boiling kettles. One might say, "What a lovely morning." Translation, "My morning was lovely until I saw you." The other replies, "Indeed it is." Translation, "If I owned a cannon, this fence would not exist." Victorians had perfected the art of sounding pleasant while radiating quiet hostility strong enough to curl the edges of the wallpaper. Family rivalries worked the same way. Cousins could exchange polite greetings at dinner while secretly tallying each other's social failures. Aunts could comment on your hairstyle in a way that implied both admiration and the suspicion that you had committed some moral crime in choosing it. No one ever insulted directly. They used implications. Implications were the Victorian version of combat. The competitive neighbourhood. Olympics. Victorian neighbourhoods were battlefields disguised as communities. Everyone wanted to appear respectable, prosperous, morally upright, and slightly more successful than the households next door. This led to competitions so petty, so determined, so deeply British that they became their own sport. Who had the cleanest front step? Front steps were scrubbed daily, sometimes twice, because nothing announced family failure faster than a dusty doorstep. If your neighbour's steps gleamed just a little brighter, the rivalry intensified. Who hosted the most impressive guests? If Lady So-and-so visited one family, the neighbours trembled. The next day they would casually mention they had entertained a colonel, or a bishop, or someone who knew someone royal. Who had the best garden? Victorian gardens were basically social ranking charts with flowers. Roses meant refinement. A thriving herb patch meant domestic competency. A dying plant meant you were on the brink of moral collapse. Neighbours inspected gardens the way modern people inspect each other's tax brackets. Who had more children who behaved? Victorians loved measuring virtue through offspring. Well-behaved children were paraded at church like trophies. Misbehaving children were hidden, denied, or blamed on a temporary phase brought on by the humidity. These competitions were never openly acknowledged. They were carried out through glances, comments, and the occasional extremely pointed compliment. Family feuds that lasted generations. Victorian families were excellent at sustaining grudges. A disagreement over inheritance could last 30 years. An argument at Christmas could divide branches of the family tree forever. A cousin who stole someone's sweetheart in 1841 might still be insulted in 1878 through pointed toasts and carefully worded birthday cards. Feuds were inherited the way some families inherit heirloom silver. Imagine a Victorian teenager asking, "Why don't we speak to Aunt Clara?" The answer might genuinely be, "Because in 1826 her great-uncle insulted your great-grandmother's jam at a harvest festival, and we have never forgiven them." And the teenager, being Victorian, would nod solemnly and accept this as perfectly reasonable. These feuds thrived quietly in snubs at weddings, missing invitations, lukewarm, thank you notes, awkward holiday dinners, strategically forgotten, birthday gifts, subtle commentary at the funerals, We're very sorry for their loss, very sorry it wasn't someone else. Victorians never forgot. They never forgave. They simply lived on, smiling gracefully. Polite. Hatred in the parlour. One of the greatest sights of Victorian passive aggression was the parlour, the arena where women displayed their hospitality while simultaneously evaluating each other with the forensic intensity of detectives. A hostess might serve tea with a smile while thinking, "I hope you spill that on your dress." A guest might admire the curtains while thinking, "Those are hiding something, aren't they?" Compliments were double-edged swords. Criticism was disguised as concern. Tea was used as both lubricant and weapon. If a neighbour brought over the baked goods, the recipient would smile warmly and later whisper, "Don't eat that. It's either poisoned or poorly made." The ultimate Victorian skill, social revenge. Victorians didn't believe in direct retaliation. That was uncivilized. Instead, they specialized in slow-burn, impeccably polite revenge. Techniques included out-hostessing a rival by throwing a bigger, shinier gathering outdressing. Someone at church out-complimenting someone in a way that sounded supportive but felt like a punch. Out-decorating the parlour. Out-smiling during unavoidable interactions. Out-mourning someone by wearing deeper black fabric. But the deadliest weapon of all? Silence. Polite, devastating silence. To ignore someone in a Victorian setting was to socially erase them. A small pause, a delayed greeting, a slight turn of the head. This was the Victorian equivalent of declaring war. Victorian politeness wasn't kindness. It was a finely sharpened blade wrapped in lace. People pretended to be civil while plotting elaborate emotional revenge, managing decades of resentment with the grace of swans and the ruthlessness of street cats. Beneath the sugar-coated smiles and warm greetings lay rivalries, grudges, suspicions, and the constant fear of social misstep. Victorian manners didn't prevent hatred. They arranged it neatly on a doily, poured tea beside it, and asked if you'd like one lump or two. Victorian Britain presented itself to the world as the pinnacle of moral refinement, domestic order, and disciplined living. Homes appeared immaculate. Families seemed harmonious. Every curtain hung beautifully, every carpet lay flat, every parlour display radiated polite serenity. If you glanced into a Victorian household from the outside, you'd see a picture-perfect universe. Tidy children, polished furniture, elegant lamps, and parents who looked as though they woke up every morning in a calm, orderly cloud of lavender-scented righteousness. But step through the front door, or better yet, peel back just one layer of that pristine wallpaper, and you'd discover a truth Victorians lived by. Everything perfect was hiding something. The Victorian world revolved around performance, not the cheerful stage play kind, but the exhausting, relentless kind that required constant vigilance. Every household became a theatre, with each family member an actor, each room a set, and every object a carefully positioned prop meant to project control, virtue, and social status. The chaos of real life didn't disappear, it simply moved backstage. Families hid clutter behind curtains and in spare rooms, hid illnesses behind lace and polite smiles, hid financial panic in locked desks, hid misbehaving relatives behind phrases like, "he's travelling," hid personal mistakes inside diaries and buried emotional turmoil under botanical wallpaper. Entire domestic systems evolved around concealing anything that could shatter the illusion of perfection. Victorian society didn't just value secrecy, it required it. Respectability wasn't just a goal, it was survival. A family's social standing controlled everything: who their children could marry, what social invitations they received, what jobs they could get, what gossip they endured, and how others treated them. One embarrassing revelation could ripple through neighbourhoods faster than the local milk cart. A household's reputation was as fragile as fine china, and just as likely to chip if handled carelessly. So, families became experts in concealment. A Appearance trumped comfort. Politeness trumped honesty. Reputation trumped reality. Victorian homes were built around this principle. Architecture supported secrecy. Hidden corridors kept servants invisible. False walls concealed structural flaws. Storage nooks held decades of accumulated clutter. And basements tucked away everything that didn't fit the narrative. Even lighting encouraged illusion. Gas lamps softened imperfections, curtains moderated the daylight, and polished surfaces reflected what the family wished others would believe. But the illusion extended beyond objects and architecture. It extended into behaviour. Victorians practiced emotional repression with Olympic precision. They hid feelings beneath layers of etiquette, like emotional millefeuille. Anger became tight smiles. Sorrow became polite withdrawal. Love transformed into coded glances and neatly folded letters. Families fought in whispers and forgave in silence. Every household was a quiet storm contained by heavy drapery and rigid social expectations. This ability to hide everything, the cracks, the struggles, the pain, the chaos, became a cultural instinct. It shaped how Victorians saw themselves, how they interacted with others, and how they judged their neighbours. And oh, how they judged. The same families who hid messy kitchens, strained relationships, and debt collectors behind ornate doors would turn around and comment on the Green family's unfortunate lack of order, because one curtain in their parlour wasn't ironed. This hypocrisy wasn't malicious. It was built into the DNA of Victorian polite society. Appearance was evidence of moral standing, and moral standing was everything. Even when innovations arrived, gas lamps, better plumbing, new heating systems, they weren't embraced for comfort, but for what they signalled socially. Having gaslighting didn't mean our home is bright. It meant we can afford to look modern. Having an elaborately set table didn't mean dinner will taste good. It meant we are civilised people with delicate sensibilities and a very exhausted cook. So how did Victorians manage this enormous pressure? With creativity, resilience, denial, and enough fabric, polish, rituals, and hidden compartments to outfit a small kingdom. Families built entire lifestyles around pretending. Pretending everything was fine. Pretending imperfections didn't exist. Pretending the world outside couldn't see the cracks. Pretending they weren't pretending. If this sounds familiar, well, it should. The Victorian obsession with curated perfection didn't disappear, it simply evolved. Today we filter our photos instead of our parlour lighting. We crop our messy rooms out of the frame instead of hiding them behind curtains. We schedule our emotions the way Victorians scheduled their smiles. We pretend to have it together online just as Victorians pretended at church. Victorian society walked so modern social media could sprint straight into pretending. But there's something remarkable, even admirable, about the Victorian commitment to crafting illusion. They built order out of chaos. They created beauty from scarcity. They mastered the art of survival through presentation. Their homes were imperfect, their lives complicated, their secrets numerous. Yet they found comfort in controlling what the world saw. Behind every polished Victorian facade was a story. Messy, flawed, human. A family terrified of judgment but determined to appear strong. A mother holding the home together with needles, thread, and late-night budgeting. A father hiding his anxieties in the locked desk. Children growing up quietly navigating both love and expectation. Servants scurrying behind walls to keep the illusion alive. Neighbours smiling while harbouring rivalries. Relatives swallowed into discreet silence. And through it all, the curtain stayed drawn, the parlour shone, the table gleamed, and the illusion survived. Victorian homes didn't show perfection. They created it, with effort, with fear, with ritual, with dusting, with secrets. They built entire worlds out of what they hid. And now, more than a century later, we finally get to pull back the curtain and see the beautifully chaotic truth.